Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly into a gray October sky, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Marcus Thompson's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his battered Ford pickup as it crawled up the winding mountain road, engine straining against the steep grade. The radio crackled with weather warnings about flash flooding in the lower valleys, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the stack of overdue bills sitting on his kitchen table and the worried look in his 9-year-old daughter's eyes when she'd asked him that morning if they were going to lose their house. "Daddy, are we almost there?" Emma's voice cut through his thoughts like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. She sat buckled in the passenger seat, her small frame dwarfed by the worn fabric, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that Marcus had attempted that morning, though several strands had already escaped to frame her face. "Just a few more miles, sweetheart," Marcus replied, forcing a smile into his voice that he didn't feel. "Mrs. Henderson said her car's been making that grinding noise for weeks. Should be an easy fix." Emma nodded, pressing her face against the window to watch the forest blur past. At 9 years old, she'd learned not to ask too many questions about why Daddy had to work so many weekends, or why they ate mac and cheese for dinner 3 nights in a row, or why her friends at school talked about family vacations to places she'd only seen in pictures. She was wise beyond her years in the way that children of single parents often become, carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. In the truck bed, Ranger lifted his massive head to taste the wind. The German Shepherd's dark eyes scanned the tree line, with an intensity that spoke of instincts honed by years of mountain living. At 5 years old, he'd been Marcus's shadow since the day they had brought him home as a puppy, back when life still made sense and the future held promises instead of threats. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and the first fat raindrops splattered against the windshield. Marcus flicked on the wipers, their rhythmic squeak adding to the symphony of mechanical sounds that had become the soundtrack of his life. The truck's heater had given up the ghost last winter, and he could see Emma's breath fogging in the growing cold. "I should have bought you a heavier jacket," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I'm okay, Daddy." Emma's voice carried that particular tone children use when they're trying to take care of their parents instead of the other way around. "Ranger keeps me warm." As if summoned by his name, the German Shepherd's ears perked up, and he turned his attention from the forest to something ahead on the road. A low whine escaped his throat, barely audible over the engine noise, but Marcus had learned to trust his dog's instincts over the years. Ranger's warnings had saved them from a black bear encounter 2 summers ago, and his restlessness had alerted Marcus to the gas leak in their neighbor's cabin that could have killed a family of 4. "What is it, boy?" Marcus slowed the truck, squinting through the rain that was now falling in earnest. The wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, creating brief moments of clarity followed by sheets of water that turned the world into an impressionist painting. That's when he saw it. The guardrail was twisted and broken, metal bent outward like the petals of some massive, destructive flower. Beyond it, the mountainside dropped away into a ravine that disappeared into the storm-darkened trees below. Fresh skid marks scarred the wet asphalt, leading directly to the gap where someone had lost control and plunged into the abyss. "Oh God," Marcus breathed, pulling over and jamming the truck into park. His heart hammered against his ribs as he threw open the door. "Emma, stay in the truck." "Daddy, what's wrong?" "Just stay here, sweetheart. Keep Ranger with you." But the German Shepherd had already vaulted over the tailgate, his powerful legs carrying him toward the broken guardrail with purpose that transcended mere curiosity. Marcus followed, his work boots slipping on the wet pavement as he reached the edge and peered down into the ravine. 30 feet below, wrapped around a massive pine tree like a broken toy, was a silver sedan. Steam rose from its crumpled hood, and the driver's side was crushed against the trunk in a way that made Marcus's stomach clench with dread. The car couldn't have been there long. The metal was still too hot, the steam too thick, the skid marks too fresh on the road above. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, then began picking his way down the steep slope with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain dog. Marcus looked back at his truck, where Emma's face was pressed against the rear window, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that children feel when they see their parents confronting something beyond their control. "Call 911!" he shouted to her, then began his own descent into the ravine. the slope was treacherous, made worse by the rain that had turned loose soil into slick mud. Marcus half slid, half climbed down, grabbing onto exposed roots and rocks to keep from tumbling headfirst into the wreckage. Above him, he could hear Emma's voice on his cell phone, speaking to the emergency dispatcher with a calmness that broke his heart. "My daddy found a car crash," she was saying. "We're on Mountain View Road, about 3 miles from the Henderson place. There's a lady in the car, and she's hurt real bad." A lady. Marcus reached the wreckage and peered through the spider-webbed windshield. Sure enough, slumped over the steering wheel was a woman, her dark hair matted with blood, her face pale as winter snow. She was wearing what looked like expensive clothes, a wool coat that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, leather boots that had never seen a day's honest work. Ranger whined and pawed at the driver's side door, which was jammed tight against the tree trunk. Marcus tried the passenger side, and after several attempts, managed to wrench it open with a screech of tortured metal. The woman was unconscious, but breathing, her pulse weak but steady beneath his fingertips. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her left arm was bent at an angle that suggested a fracture. But it was what he saw in the back seat that made him freeze. A black duffel bag, partially unzipped, revealing neat stacks of cash. More money than Marcus had ever seen in one place. And beside it, wrapped in a towel but unmistakably recognizable, the outline of a handgun. "Daddy!" Emma's voice echoed down from the road above. "The ambulance is coming! They said 15 minutes!" 15 minutes in this weather, on these roads, with this woman bleeding and unconscious. Marcus looked at the stranger's face, noting the small scar above her left eyebrow, the expensive manicure on fingernails that had never known manual labor, the kind of subtle makeup that spoke of city sophistication. Who was she? What was she doing on this remote mountain road with a bag full of cash and a gun? And why did Marcus get the feeling that saving her life was about to change everything? 3 years, that's how long it had been since Marcus Thompson's world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. 3 years since cancer took his wife Rebecca, leaving him alone to navigate the treacherous waters of single parenthood in a town that measured success by how well you kept up appearances. 3 years of learning that love wasn't enough to pay the bills, that good intentions couldn't fix a broken transmission, and that a man could feel completely lost even when he knew exactly where he was going. The Thompson family home sat at the end of Maple Creek Road like a monument to better times. 2 stories of weathered clapboard siding, painted white once upon a time, but now showing more gray than anything else. The front porch sagged slightly on the left side, where the foundation had settled, and the screen door hung askew on hinges that squeaked a protest every time someone passed through. Rebecca had always talked about fixing that door, about repainting the house, about replacing the cracked windows in the upstairs bedrooms. Now, Marcus looked at those unfinished projects and saw only reminders of dreams that would never come true. His workshop occupied the converted garage behind the house, a cluttered sanctuary filled with the tools of his trade and the smell of motor oil and old metal. This was where Marcus spent most of his waking hours, coaxing life back into engines that other mechanics had given up on, rebuilding transmissions with parts salvaged from junkyards, performing mechanical miracles for customers who paid him in cash when they could and IOUs when they couldn't. Thompson's Garage, the hand-painted sign read, though there was no actual garage anymore, just Marcus and his tools and a reputation for being able to fix anything with an engine. He'd been the best mechanic in 3 counties when Rebecca was alive, back when he had the luxury of choosing which jobs to take and which customers to turn away. Now, he couldn't afford to be selective. Every broken-down truck, every sputtering lawnmower, every temperamental generator was a chance to keep the electricity on for another month. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Marcus woke at 5:30 to the sound of his ancient alarm clock, a wind-up model that Rebecca had inherited from her grandmother. He made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used since college, black coffee because they'd run out of cream 2 days ago and wouldn't get paid for the Henderson job until this afternoon. He checked on Emma, still sleeping with her arms wrapped around the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since her mother's funeral, her face peaceful in the early morning light, filtering through curtains that Rebecca had sewn by hand. By 6 o'clock, Marcus was in his workshop, starting work on a 1994 Chevy pickup that belonged to Jack Martinez, the owner of the local hardware store. The transmission was shot, and Jack couldn't afford a replacement, so Marcus was rebuilding it from scratch using parts he'd scavenged from 2 other trucks and a prayer that everything would fit together properly. It was painstaking work, the kind that required patience and precision and the ability to see solutions where other people saw only problems. "Daddy, breakfast is ready." Emma's voice drifted across the yard as she stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her pajamas and holding a plate of scrambled eggs that she'd made herself. At 9 years old, she was already more responsible than most teenagers, taking care of herself and her father with a maturity that broke Marcus's heart every day. "Be right there, sweetheart," he called back, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. The eggs were slightly overcooked and undersalted, but Marcus ate them with enthusiasm because Emma had made them, and because he'd learned that small kindnesses were often the only things that stood between a man and despair. They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table that Rebecca had bought at a garage sale 12 years ago, refinished by hand, and painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to cream over the years. Emma chattered about her upcoming school project on Colorado wildlife, about how Tommy Morrison had brought his pet snake for show and tell, about how Mrs. Patterson had asked her to help feed the class hamster over Christmas break. Normal 9-year-old concerns, the kind of innocent preoccupations that made Marcus grateful and guilty in equal measure. "Can we get a hamster?" Emma asked, swinging her legs beneath the table in a rhythm that only children can maintain without thinking. "Mrs. Patterson says they're really easy to take care of, and Ranger wouldn't mind. He likes small animals." Marcus looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. A hamster meant a cage, bedding, food, veterinary bills, expenses that might seem small to other families, but loomed large in a budget already stretched to the breaking point. "Maybe for your birthday," he said, hating himself for the lie, even as it bought him time to figure out how to make it true. Emma's 10th birthday was still 4 months away. 4 months to find the extra money for a pet that would make his daughter smile. Really? Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning, and Marcus felt his resolve crumble. He would find a way to get her that hamster, even if it meant skipping meals or working extra jobs or selling something he couldn't afford to lose. "Really," he said, and meant it, even though he had no idea how he would make it happen. After breakfast, Marcus drove Emma to Maplewood Elementary in his pickup truck, the radio playing country music at low volume while they navigated the familiar streets of Pine Ridge, Colorado. Population 3,847, according to the sign at the town limits, though Marcus suspected that number was optimistic. This was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where success was measured in terms of how well you maintained your property and how regularly you attended church on Sunday. Pine Ridge had been built around the lumber industry back in the 1920s, when the forests seemed inexhaustible and the demand for Colorado timber was strong enough to support 3 sawmills and a railroad spur. Those days were long gone. The mills closed and the railroad tracks pulled up for scrap metal, leaving behind a town that survived on tourism in the summer and stubbornness in the winter. Most of the young people left for Denver or Colorado Springs as soon as they graduated high school, seeking opportunities that Pine Ridge simply couldn't provide. Marcus had been one of the lucky ones, finding work at Patterson's Auto Center right out of high school, learning his trade from old Pete Patterson, who'd been fixing cars since before computers were invented. He'd married Rebecca 2 years later, bought the house on Maple Creek Road, and settled into the kind of life that previous generations had taken for granted. Steady work, a growing family, a community that looked out for its own. Then the cancer came, and the medical bills, and the gradual realization that tragedy didn't care how good a person you were, or how hard you worked, or how much you loved your family. "Have a good day, sweetheart," Marcus said, as Emma hopped out of the truck in front of the elementary school. "I'll pick you up at 3:30. "Love you, Daddy," Emma called back, already running toward the playground, where her friends were gathered around the jungle gym like birds on a wire. Marcus watched her go, noting how her backpack was slightly too big for her small frame, how her shoes were showing wear at the heels, how she moved with the unconscious confidence of a child who still believed that adults could fix anything. The drive to Mrs. Henderson's house took him through the older part of town, past the Methodist church where Rebecca's funeral had been held, past the cemetery where she was buried, under a simple headstone that had taken Marcus 6 months to pay for. He tried not to look at these reminders of loss, but Pine Ridge was too small to avoid the geography of grief. Every street held memories, every building told a story, and most of those stories now carried the bitter aftertaste of what might have been. Margaret Henderson lived in a Victorian house on Elm Street, complete with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that spoke of a time when people had both the money and the leisure to care about architectural details. She was a widow herself, though her husband had left her well provided for, with a pension from his 30 years at the power company and a life insurance policy that paid off the mortgage and then some. She could afford to be generous with neighbors who were struggling, which made Marcus both grateful and uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Marcus, thank goodness you're here," Mrs. Henderson said as she opened the front door, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "That car has been making the most awful noise for weeks. I was afraid to drive it to church yesterday." The car in question was a 2018 Honda Civic, barely broken in and still under warranty, but Mrs. Henderson preferred to support local businesses rather than deal with the dealership in Colorado Springs. Marcus popped the hood and immediately diagnosed the problem, a worn belt that would take 15 minutes to replace and cost maybe $20 in parts. An easy fix that would net him $50 cash and keep the lights on for another few days. "Should have her purring like new in no time," Marcus said, already reaching for his tools. This was the kind of work he could do in his sleep, the kind of routine maintenance that paid the bills and required more time than skill. "You're such a blessing, Marcus," Mrs. Henderson said, and he could hear the genuine affection in her voice. "I don't know what this town would do without you. Your father would be so proud." Marcus's father had been Pine Ridge's fire chief for 22 years, a man whose reputation for integrity and community service had opened doors for his son throughout the town. Sometimes Marcus felt like he was still living in his father's shadow, still trying to measure up to a standard of civic virtue that seemed increasingly impossible to maintain in a world that valued profit over principle. The belt replacement went smoothly, and Marcus was cleaning up his tools when Mrs. Henderson reappeared with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression that he'd learned to recognize over the years. "Marcus, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you and Emma doing? Really doing? I know it can't be easy, raising a child on your own, trying to make ends meet with the way things are these days." It was a kindly meant question, the sort that neighbors asked when they genuinely cared about your welfare. But it was also the kind of question that reminded Marcus of how precarious his situation had become, how close he was to losing everything that mattered. "We're managing," he said, which was the truth and a lie at the same time. They were managing barely, day by day, paycheck to paycheck. But management wasn't the same as stability, and stability wasn't the same as security. "If you ever need anything," Mrs. Henderson continued, "if Emma needs school supplies or winter clothes or anything at all, you just let me know. We look out for each other in this town." Marcus nodded his thanks, pocketed the $50 in cash, and drove back toward home with the radio playing softly and his mind wrestling with the mathematics of survival. $50 today, maybe another 100 from the Martinez transmission job later in the week, possibly a few odd jobs over the weekend if he was lucky. It was enough to keep going, but not enough to get ahead. The kind of financial treadmill that exhausted the soul as much as the body. The house felt empty when he returned, even with Ranger there to greet him with enthusiastic tail wagging and a tennis ball clenched in his jaws. The German Shepherd had been Rebecca's idea, a puppy she'd insisted on adopting from the animal shelter during her first round of chemotherapy. "Every family needs a dog," she'd said, and she'd been right, though Marcus suspected she'd also been thinking about what would happen after she was gone, about how a loyal companion might help fill the void she would leave behind. Ranger was more than just a pet. He was family, the kind of intelligent, intuitive animal that seemed to understand human emotions better than most humans did. He'd been Rebecca's constant companion during her illness, sensing when she needed comfort and when she needed space, staying close during the bad days and celebrating the good ones, with the uncomplicated joy that only dogs possess. After her death, he'd transferred that loyalty to Marcus and Emma, becoming their protector and confidant, and the steadiest presence in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. "Just you and me today, boy," Marcus said, scratching behind the dog's ears as they stood in the empty kitchen. Through the window, he could see his workshop waiting for him, the Martinez transmission job that would take most of the afternoon and hopefully result in another few $100s toward the month's expenses. It was honest work, the kind his father would have respected. But some days Marcus wondered if honest work was enough anymore, if there was still a place in the world for men who fixed things instead of just replacing them. The afternoon stretched ahead like an empty road, punctuated only by the rhythm of work and the occasional appearance of neighbors who needed small repairs or advice about their aging vehicles. This was Marcus Thompson's life now, a series of mechanical problems to solve, bills to pay, moments of connection with his daughter, and the persistent hope that tomorrow might be better than today. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had, and he was determined to make it work, no matter what it took. The ambulance arrived exactly 15 minutes later, its red and blue lights cutting through the gray afternoon like emergency beacons in a fog. Marcus had managed to stabilize the woman's neck and keep her warm with his jacket, while Ranger maintained a protective vigil beside the wreckage, his dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, as if sensing dangers that human perception couldn't detect. "Good work," said Tom Bradley, the lead paramedic, as he and his partner carefully extracted the unconscious woman from the twisted metal. "You probably saved her life getting here when you did. Another hour in this cold and weather, and we'd be dealing with a very different situation." Marcus watched as they loaded her onto a stretcher, noting how the paramedics handled the bag of cash and the weapon with professional discretion. Small towns bred a certain understanding about minding your own business, but curiosity was human nature, and Marcus found himself wondering what kind of trouble this woman had been running from or toward when her car left the road. "What hospital are you taking her to?" Marcus asked as the ambulance crew prepared to depart. "St. Mary's in Cedar Falls," Tom replied, checking his watch. 20-minute drive in good weather, maybe 30 in this mess. You planning to follow up? Sometimes people like to know how their rescues turn out. Marcus looked at Emma, who had climbed out of the truck and was now standing beside him, with Ranger pressed against her legs. His daughter's eyes were wide with the kind of concern that children feel when they witness adult emergencies. The realization that the world contains dangers that parents can't always protect them from. "Maybe," Marcus said. "Let me get Emma home first." The ambulance disappeared down the mountain road, its siren fading into the distance until only the sound of rain on wet pavement remained. Marcus and Emma drove home in relative silence, both of them processing what they had witnessed in their own ways. Ranger rode in the truck bed as usual, but Marcus could see him in the rearview mirror, more alert than normal, his head turning to track sounds and movements that seemed to carry significance beyond mere canine curiosity. That evening, after Emma had finished her homework and gone to bed with her stuffed rabbit, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on the technical manual he'd been reading about fuel injection systems. His mind kept returning to the woman in the car, to the bag full of money, to the gun wrapped in a towel. In Pine Ridge, people didn't carry that kind of cash or that kind of protection unless they were involved in something that required both secrecy and security. 2 days later, Marcus was replacing the brake pads on Jenny Morrison's Honda when his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I believe you're the man who saved my life on Mountain View Road." Her voice was clear and educated, with just a hint of an accent that suggested East Coast origins. There was something about her tone that conveyed both gratitude and guardedness, as if she was grateful for his help, but cautious about revealing too much about herself. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, setting down his wrench and giving the conversation his full attention. "The paramedics said you had a concussion and some broken ribs." "I'm much better, thank you. The doctors say I should make a full recovery, though I'm going to be moving pretty slowly for the next few weeks. I was hoping I might be able to meet you and thank you properly for what you did. And I'd like to meet your daughter as well. Emma, isn't it? The nurses told me she was the one who called 911. Marcus felt a warmth spreading through his chest at the mention of Emma's contribution to the rescue. His daughter had handled the emergency with remarkable composure for a 9-year-old, and it meant something to him that this stranger recognized her part in saving a life. "She'd like that," Marcus said. "She's been asking about you, wondering if you were okay. Where are you staying? I could bring her by to visit if you're up for it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Marcus to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Dr. Mitchell spoke again, there was something different in her voice, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. The doctors don't want me driving for at least another week, and I don't really have anywhere to go. I was hoping, well, this might sound presumptuous, but I was wondering if you might know of a place I could stay around Pine Ridge, a hotel or a bed and breakfast, somewhere quiet where I could rest and recover. Marcus frowned, thinking about the limited accommodations available in their small town. The Pine Ridge Motor Lodge had closed 2 years ago when the owner couldn't afford to keep up with building codes, and the nearest hotel was 30 miles away in Cedar Falls. There was Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, but she only rented to long-term tenants, and the rates were beyond what most visitors could afford. Accommodations are pretty limited around here, Marcus said slowly. Most folks who visit have family to stay with. What about your own family? Don't you have people who could help you out? Another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that suggested painful memories. When Dr. Mitchell spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't have family, Mr. Thompson. Not anymore. I was traveling alone when the accident happened, and I don't really have anywhere else to go. I know this is a lot to ask, but I was wondering if you might consider letting me rent a room from you for a week or two, just until I'm strong enough to drive again. I can pay whatever you think is fair. Marcus set down the phone and looked around his workshop, trying to process what he'd just heard. A stranger was asking to stay in his home, a woman he knew almost nothing about, except that she'd been carrying a suspicious amount of cash and a weapon when he'd found her. Common sense told him to politely decline, to help her find alternative arrangements that didn't involve bringing unknown quantities into his carefully ordered life with Emma. But there was something in Dr. Mitchell's voice that reminded him of his own loneliness, the particular isolation that came from facing the world without the support system that most people took for granted. And there was the matter of the empty guest room that had been sitting unused since Rebecca's sister had visited for the funeral 3 years ago, a space that served no purpose except to remind Marcus of all the visitors they no longer received. Dr. Mitchell, Marcus said finally, why don't you tell me a little more about yourself? What kind of doctor are you, and what brought you to Colorado? I'm a veterinarian, she replied, and Marcus could hear relief in her voice at being asked a question she could answer honestly. I specialize in wildlife medicine, and I was on my way to consult on a project at Rocky Mountain National Park. There's been some concern about disease transmission between domestic animals and the local elk population, and they wanted someone with experience in cross-species epidemiology. It was a plausible story, the kind of specialized work that might indeed bring an expert to their remote corner of Colorado. But Marcus had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and something about her explanation felt rehearsed, as if she'd prepared this particular narrative for exactly this kind of conversation. And you're from where originally? Boston. I did my veterinary training at Tufts, then specialized in wildlife medicine at UC Davis. I've been doing consulting work for the past few years, traveling to different projects around the country. The biographical details came smoothly, but Marcus noticed that she hadn't mentioned where she was currently based, who she worked for, or how long she'd been in Colorado before the accident. These weren't necessarily suspicious omissions, but they created gaps in her story that left room for questions he wasn't sure he should ask. Mr. Thompson, I know this is an unusual request, Dr. Mitchell continued when Marcus didn't immediately respond. I'm essentially asking you to trust a stranger, and I understand if that's not something you're comfortable with. But I promise you that I'm not dangerous, and I'm not running from the law or anything like that. I'm just someone who got hurt and needs a place to recover, and I'm willing to pay generously for the privilege. The mention of payment got Marcus's attention in ways that he wasn't entirely proud of. The stack of overdue bills on his kitchen table represented a constant source of stress, and the prospect of rental income, even temporary rental income, was difficult to ignore. But more than that, there was something about Dr. Mitchell's voice that appealed to his protective instincts, the same impulse that had driven him down into that ravine to help a stranger in need. I'll tell you what, Marcus said. Why don't you come by the house this evening, meet Emma and me properly, and we can talk about arrangements. No commitments, just a conversation between neighbors. Does that work for you? That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson. You have no idea how much this means to me. After they hung up, Marcus found himself staring at the phone and wondering if he'd just made a very good decision or a very bad one. On one hand, he was potentially helping someone in genuine need while earning some much-needed income. On the other hand, he was inviting a woman with mysterious baggage into a home where his 9-year-old daughter slept every night. Ranger appeared in the workshop doorway, as if summoned by Marcus's uncertainty, the German shepherd's intelligent eyes studying his master's face with the kind of attention that suggested he understood more than a dog should reasonably understand. Rebecca had always claimed that Ranger could read people's intentions, that he had an uncanny ability to distinguish between those who meant harm and those who could be trusted. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Should we help the lady doctor?" Ranger's tail wagged once, a measured response that seemed to suggest cautious optimism rather than enthusiastic approval. It was the kind of reaction that Marcus had learned to interpret as his dog's way of saying, "Let's wait and see." That evening, Marcus prepared dinner with more care than usual, making sure the house was clean and that Emma understood they would be having a visitor. He'd explained about Dr. Mitchell's request in terms that a 9-year-old could understand, that the lady from the car accident needed a place to stay while she got better, and that they were considering helping her out. "Is she nice?" Emma asked, as she set the table with their second-best dishes, the ones they used when Pastor Williams came for dinner, or when Mrs. Henderson invited herself over for coffee. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. That's why she's coming to visit, so we can get to know each other a little bit." "Will she like Ranger?" Marcus smiled at his daughter's priorities. In Emma's world, the most important quality any adult could possess was an appreciation for their dog's unique personality and intelligence. "I hope so. Dr. Mitchell is a veterinarian, which means she takes care of animals for a living. So, I'm guessing she probably likes dogs." Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, driving a rental car that still had temporary plates and a pristine interior that suggested it had been picked up from the airport very recently. She was smaller than Marcus had expected, probably 5'4" in her flat-soled shoes, with dark hair that had been styled to hide the bandage on her forehead. She moved carefully, favoring her left side where the broken ribs were still healing, but there was something about her posture that suggested underlying strength despite her current injuries. "Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for inviting me," she said as Marcus opened the front door. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her eyes were the kind of clear gray that seemed to see everything without revealing anything in return. "Please, call me Marcus. And this is Emma." Emma stepped forward with the kind of shy confidence that she'd learned from watching her father interact with customers, polite but not overeager, friendly but not presumptuous. "Hi, Dr. Mitchell. Daddy says you take care of animals." "That's right, Emma, and please call me Sarah. I heard you were the one who called 911 when your father found me. That was very brave of you." Emma beamed at the praise, and Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest at seeing his daughter respond to adult approval. There had been too few positive interactions with strangers in Emma's life lately, too many conversations that revolved around money and bills and the various challenges of single parenthood. Ranger appeared in the hallway, drawn by the sound of a new voice, and Marcus watched carefully as Dr. Mitchell's face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing the German shepherd. "And you must be Ranger," she said, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "Your family told me all about you." Ranger approached cautiously, his usual wariness of strangers tempered by curiosity about someone who clearly understood proper canine etiquette. He sniffed her outstretched hand, then allowed her to scratch behind his ears with the kind of expert technique that suggested real experience with animals. "He's beautiful," Sarah said, running her hands through Ranger's thick coat with the confidence of someone who knew how to read canine body language. German shepherds are remarkable dogs. Incredibly intelligent, loyal, protective of their families. This one looks like he's been well trained. "Rebecca, my late wife, she worked with him a lot," Marcus said, noting how Ranger seemed to be accepting their visitor with unusual ease. "He was her project, really. She said every family needed a good dog." She was absolutely right. "May I ask how long ago you lost her?" It was a gentle question, asked with the kind of professional sympathy that suggested Sarah had experience dealing with grief and loss. Marcus found himself appreciating her directness. Most people in Pine Ridge either avoided the subject of Rebecca entirely or approached it with such elaborate delicacy that conversations became exercises in emotional tiptoeing. 3 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially with Emma so young. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to say more on the subject. But something about Sarah's manner suggested that she understood loss in personal, rather than merely professional terms, that her sympathy came from experience rather than training. They had dinner in the kitchen, simple fare of grilled chicken and vegetables that Marcus had prepared with Emma's help. Sarah ate with obvious appetite despite her injuries, praising Emma's contribution to the meal and asking intelligent questions about Marcus's work as a mechanic. The conversation flowed more easily than Marcus had expected, touching on safe topics like the weather, the changing seasons, and Emma's upcoming school project on Colorado wildlife. I might be able to help with that project, Sarah said when Emma mentioned her assignment. I've spent a lot of time studying the animals that live in these mountains. Maybe we could talk about elk and deer and how they've adapted to living at high altitude. Emma's face lit up with excitement at the prospect of expert help with her homework, and Marcus found himself warming to their guest despite his initial reservations. There was something about Sarah Mitchell that invited trust, a quality of attention and genuine interest that made both him and Emma feel heard and valued. After dinner, while Emma was upstairs brushing her teeth, Marcus and Sarah sat in the living room with coffee. Ranger sprawled contentedly on the rug between them. You have a wonderful daughter, Sarah said, cradling her mug in both hands as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. She's bright, polite, and clearly adores you. You should be proud. She's the best thing in my life, Marcus replied, meaning every word. Some days I wonder if I'm doing right by her, raising her alone in a place like this. But she seems happy, and that's what matters most. Happiness is more important than money or opportunities, Sarah said quietly. Trust me on that. Emma has something that a lot of children in big cities don't have. She has a father who loves her unconditionally and a community that knows her name. That's worth more than most people realize. There was something in her tone that suggested personal knowledge of what children in big cities might lack, but Marcus didn't press for details. Instead, he found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her gray eyes, the way she held herself despite her injuries, the expensive watch on her wrist that seemed at odds with the simple clothes she was wearing. So, Marcus said finally, tell me more about this project that brought you to Colorado. Wildlife disease transmission sounds pretty specialized. Sarah's smile was rueful, as if she'd been expecting this question and wasn't entirely sure how to answer it. It is specialized. Maybe more specialized than I led you to believe. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. The truth is, Mr. Thompson, Marcus, I'm not just a veterinarian. I work for the Drug Enforcement Administration as a consultant, helping them understand how illegal drug operations affect local wildlife populations. The project at Rocky Mountain National Park involves investigating contamination from illegal marijuana grow operations on federal land. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications of her confession sank in. This woman wasn't just a veterinarian. She was a federal agent, or at least someone who worked closely with federal agents. And she was asking to stay in his home, where his daughter lived, while investigating drug operations that might involve dangerous people, with reasons to harm those who threatened their business. DEA, he said slowly. That explains the money and the gun. Sarah nodded, her gray eyes never leaving his face. I know this changes things. I know you probably have concerns about getting involved with someone in my line of work, but I want you to know that the accident really was just an accident. I hit a patch of ice and lost control. I'm not being chased by drug dealers or running from some kind of immediate threat. I'm just someone who got hurt and needs a place to recover before I can get back to work. Marcus looked at Ranger, who was watching the conversation with the kind of alert attention that suggested the dog understood the seriousness of what was being discussed. His wife had always claimed that Ranger could judge character better than most humans, and the German Shepherd seemed remarkably comfortable with their visitor, despite her dangerous profession. Why didn't you tell me this over the phone? Marcus asked. Because I was afraid you'd hang up, Sarah admitted. And because I wanted you to meet me first, to see that I'm not some kind of dangerous character who would put your family at risk. I'm good at my job, Marcus, and part of being good at my job is being careful about security and operational awareness. The kind of people I investigate don't usually target the families of people who help federal agents, especially in cases where those agents are just recovering from accidents. It was a reasonable explanation, but Marcus found himself thinking about Emma sleeping upstairs, about the quiet life they'd built in Pine Ridge, about the various ways that law enforcement work could complicate the existence of innocent bystanders. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "It's not just about me. I have Emma to consider, and her safety comes before everything else." "Of course," Sarah said, setting down her coffee mug and preparing to leave. "I completely understand. Take all the time you need to decide. And if you decide that having me stay here isn't something you're comfortable with, I'll respect that decision completely." She stood to go, moving carefully because of her injuries, and Marcus found himself reluctant to see her leave despite his concerns about her profession. There was something about Sarah Mitchell that appealed to him beyond mere physical attraction. Though he had to admit that she was a beautiful woman, it was more about the way she interacted with Emma, the genuine interest she'd shown in their lives, the quality of attention she brought to even mundane conversations. "I'll call you tomorrow," Marcus said as he walked her to the door. "One way or the other. Thank you for dinner and for considering my request. Whatever you decide, I want you to know how grateful I am for what you did that day on the mountain. You saved my life, and that's not something I'll ever forget." After she left, Marcus sat in his living room with Ranger at his feet, weighing the various factors that would influence his decision. On one hand, Sarah seemed like a decent person who genuinely needed help, and the rental income would make a real difference in his family's financial situation. On the other hand, federal law enforcement work brought risks that he wasn't sure he wanted to expose Emma to, even indirectly. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "Should we trust the lady federal agent?" Ranger's tail wagged once, the same measured response he'd given before, but this time Marcus thought he detected a slight increase in enthusiasm. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it wasn't a warning either. Tomorrow he would have to make a decision that could change the trajectory of his and Emma's life. Tonight, he would lie awake thinking about gray eyes and federal badges, and the way Sarah Mitchell had looked when she'd talked about Emma's happiness being more important than money or opportunities. Some decisions, Marcus reflected, were harder than others. And some strangers, despite their dangerous professions and mysterious backgrounds, had a way of making those decisions feel like opportunities rather than threats. The decision came to Marcus at 3 a.m, the way important decisions often do, quietly, in the darkness between sleep and waking, when the mind finally stops wrestling with logic and allows the heart to speak. He lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling around him, the soft creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through pine trees, and realized that he'd already made up his mind the moment Sarah Mitchell had knelt down to greet Ranger with genuine affection. When morning came, Marcus called her before he could second-guess himself. "Dr. Mitchell, it's Marcus Thompson. If the offer still stands, Emma and I would like to help you out. You're welcome to stay in our guest room while you recover." The relief in her voice was unmistakable. "Marcus, thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me. Are you sure? I know having a stranger in your home is a big step, especially with Emma to consider." "Ranger likes you," Marcus said simply, "and he's never wrong about people. We'll make it work." Sarah moved in that afternoon, arriving with a single suitcase and a box of medical supplies that she explained were necessary for managing her recovery. Marcus helped her carry her belongings to the guest room, noting how light her luggage was for someone who claimed to be traveling for work. Either she traveled extremely light, or this wasn't the extended business trip she'd originally described. "This is perfect," Sarah said as she looked around the guest room, taking in the quilted bedspread that Rebecca had made, the simple wooden furniture that Marcus had built himself, and the view of the mountains through windows framed by curtains that still smelled faintly of his wife's lavender sachets. "It feels like a real home." There was something wistful in her voice that made Marcus wonder about her own living situation, whether she had a home somewhere that felt permanent and welcoming, or if her work kept her constantly moving between anonymous hotel rooms and temporary accommodations. Emma was practically vibrating with excitement at having a house guest, especially one who had promised to help with her wildlife project. At dinner that first night, She peppered Sarah with questions about animals and veterinary medicine, her enthusiasm infectious enough to make even Marcus smile, despite his lingering concerns about the wisdom of their arrangement. "Do you have any pets of your own?" Emma asked as she carefully cut her chicken into precise 9-year-old sized pieces. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Marcus caught a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, or regret, cross her features before she answered. "I had a dog once, a golden retriever named Sam. He was killed in the line of duty." "Your dog worked with you?" Emma's eyes widened with fascination. "Like a police dog?" "Something like that," Sarah said softly. "He was trained to detect certain substances, to help with investigations. He was very brave and very good at his job." Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face as she spoke about her lost partner, noting the genuine grief in her expression. Whatever else might be mysterious about Dr. Sarah Mitchell, her love for animals was clearly authentic, as was her pain at losing one who had meant something to her. "I'm sorry," Emma said with the simple directness that children bring to expressions of sympathy. "Losing a dog is really hard. When we got Ranger, Mama said he would be with us forever, but then Mama died anyway, so I know that forever doesn't always mean what grown-ups think it means." The unexpected wisdom in Emma's words hung in the air like a blessing and a challenge, forcing all three adults, including Sarah, to confront the reality that love always comes with the possibility of loss, and that knowing this doesn't make the loving any less worthwhile. "Your mama was right about love, even if forever turned out to be different than she expected," Sarah said gently. "The love doesn't die when someone goes away. It just changes shape, becomes something you carry inside instead of something you share every day." Marcus felt his throat tighten at Sarah's words, partly because they captured something true about his relationship with Rebecca's memory, and partly because they suggested that Sarah herself understood this particular kind of grief from personal experience. After dinner, while Emma was upstairs reading, Marcus and Sarah found themselves in the kitchen doing dishes together with the kind of easy cooperation that usually took weeks to develop between housemates. Sarah washed while Marcus dried, their movements falling into a comfortable rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. "Thank you for what you said to Emma about her mother," Marcus said as he put away the last of the plates. "She doesn't often get to talk about Rebecca with someone who understands that kind of loss." "She's a remarkable child," Sarah replied, draining the sink and hanging up the dish towel with the careful attention of someone who was used to taking care of herself. "You can see Rebecca's influence in her, the kindness, the emotional intelligence, the way she thinks about other people's feelings. You're doing a wonderful job raising her." It was the kind of compliment that Marcus rarely heard, and coming from someone with Sarah's obvious intelligence and professional competence, it meant more than he wanted to admit. Single parenthood was a constant exercise in second-guessing, wondering if he was providing enough emotional support, enough stability, enough of the maternal presence that Emma had lost too young. "Some days I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along," Marcus admitted. "Rebecca was the one who understood how to talk to children, how to explain difficult things in ways that made sense. I'm better with engines than emotions." "From what I can see, you're better with emotions than you think," Sarah said. "Emma feels secure, loved, and free to be herself. That doesn't happen by accident." They moved to the living room, where Ranger was sprawled in front of the fireplace like a golden brown rug with aspirations. Sarah settled into Rebecca's old chair, the one Marcus had never been able to bring himself to sit in, and the German Shepherd immediately got up and positioned himself beside her, resting his massive head on her knee, with the kind of trust that he usually reserved for family members. "He really does like you," Marcus observed, settling onto the couch with a cup of coffee. "Ranger's usually more cautious with strangers." "Animals can sense when someone genuinely cares about them," Sarah said, scratching behind Ranger's ears with the expert technique of someone who understood canine psychology. "I think they also pick up on loneliness. Maybe he recognizes a kindred spirit." It was an unexpectedly personal confession, this admission of loneliness, and Marcus found himself reassessing his guest. Whatever brought Sarah Mitchell to his door, it wasn't just professional necessity. There was something about her that suggested she needed the warmth of a real home, as much as she needed a place to recover from her injuries. "What's it like?" Marcus asked. "The kind of work you do, traveling all the time, investigating dangerous people?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving rhythmically through Ranger's fur, as she seemed to consider how much truth to reveal. Isolating, she said finally. You learn not to trust easily, not to form attachments that could be used against you or put other people at risk. You become very good at being alone, maybe too good. After a while, you start to forget what it feels like to be part of something normal, something stable. Is that why you don't have family? Because of the work? Partly. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. The work makes relationships difficult, but the truth is, I didn't have much family to begin with. My parents died when I was in college, and I was an only child. I threw myself into my career partly because it was easier than figuring out how to build a personal life from scratch. Marcus understood that impulse more than he cared to admit. After Rebecca's death, work had been his refuge too, the one place where problems had clear solutions and success could be measured in terms of functioning engines and satisfied customers. It was easier to fix carburetors than to fix the empty spaces in a house that had once been full of laughter. But this, Sarah continued, gesturing around the living room with its comfortable furniture and family photographs. This is what I've been missing. The sound of a child doing homework upstairs, the ritual of shared meals, the way a dog chooses to trust you with his affection. This is what a real home feels like. Her words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Marcus acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd had a meaningful conversation with another adult. The daily interactions with customers and neighbors were pleasant enough, but they rarely went deeper than the surface courtesies that small-town life required. Sarah was offering something different, real connection, genuine understanding, the possibility of friendship based on more than just shared geography. You're welcome here as long as you need to be, Marcus heard himself saying, and was surprised by how much he meant it. Emma's already planning to show you her rock collection tomorrow, and I think Ranger would stage a revolt if you left too soon. Sarah's smile was like sunrise after a long night, transforming her face in ways that had nothing to do with physical beauty, and everything to do with the kind of happiness that comes from unexpected grace. I can't remember the last time I looked forward to seeing someone's rock collection, she said, and Marcus could hear the wonder in her voice, as if she was rediscovering parts of herself that her professional life had forced her to set aside. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen, a sound that had been absent from his house for so long that it took him a moment to identify it. He found Sarah and Emma working together to make pancakes, flour dusting Sarah's dark hair, and Emma giggling at some story their guest was telling about a raccoon family that had taken up residence in a research station where she'd once worked. "Daddy, Sarah knows everything about animals," Emma announced as Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. "She's going to help me write the best wildlife project in the whole school." "Is she now?" Marcus poured himself coffee and settled at the kitchen table, content to watch his daughter's animated conversation with someone who clearly appreciated her curiosity and intelligence. "Did you know that elk can run 35 miles per hour?" Emma continued, her voice bubbling with excitement. "And they have a special call that they use to find each other in the forest, and the babies stay with their mothers for almost a whole year?" "I did not know that," Marcus said solemnly, earning himself an approving nod from Emma, who took the sharing of animal facts very seriously. Sarah flipped a pancake with professional precision, and Marcus found himself watching the easy way she moved around his kitchen, as if she'd been making breakfast for his family for years instead of days. There was something deeply appealing about the domestic scene, about the way Sarah's presence seemed to complete a picture that had been missing essential elements since Rebecca's death. After breakfast, while Emma was getting ready for school, Sarah insisted on cleaning up the kitchen, moving carefully because of her healing ribs, but with obvious determination to contribute to the household routine. "You don't have to do that," Marcus said, but Sarah waved off his protest. "I want to earn my keep. Besides, it feels good to be useful, to be part of something instead of just passing through." Marcus understood that feeling, the need to contribute, to be valuable to the people around you. It was one of the reasons he'd become a mechanic in the first place, the satisfaction of solving problems, of making things work better than they had before, of being needed by his community in tangible, measurable ways. "Sarah," Emma called from the hallway, "do you want to walk me to school? Daddy usually drives me, but it's nice today and you could meet my friends." Marcus saw something shift in Sarah's expression, a momentary tension that suggested the simple request had triggered some kind of internal alarm. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, seeking permission or maybe reassurance, and he realized that for someone in law enforcement work, being seen publicly with a new family might represent a kind of exposure that her training told her to avoid. "If you're not comfortable," Marcus began, but Sarah shook her head. "No, I'd love to walk with Emma. It's just been a while since I've done anything that normal, that innocent. I'd forgotten what it feels like to not worry about who might be watching." The three of them walked to Maplewood Elementary together, Ranger trotting alongside on his leash with the dignified bearing of a dog who understood his role as family protector. Emma chattered the entire way, pointing out landmarks and telling Sarah about her teachers, her friends, the drama of fourth-grade social dynamics that seem both incredibly important and utterly trivial, depending on your perspective. Other parents and children greeted them along the way, their curiosity about Marcus's house guest politely contained but clearly present. Pine Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the appearance of an attractive woman staying with the town's most eligible widower was bound to generate discussion. "Is that your new girlfriend?" asked Tommy Morrison as they reached the school playground, his 9-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of what all the adults were thinking, but were too polite to ask. "Dr. Mitchell is our house guest," Emma replied with the diplomatic precision of a child who had learned to protect her father's privacy. "She's helping me with my animal project." Marcus felt grateful for his daughter's discretion, but also aware that the question would follow them through their daily interactions with neighbors and customers. Pine Ridge was a community that cared about its members, but that caring came with a level of scrutiny that could feel invasive when you were navigating new relationships. After they dropped Emma off at school, Marcus and Sarah walked home in comfortable silence, Ranger investigating interesting smells along the route with the thoroughness of a detective gathering evidence. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the mountains looked close enough to touch in the clear October light. "Thank you," Sarah said as they turned onto Maple Creek Road, "for letting me be part of Emma's morning routine. I know having a stranger insert herself into your family life can't be easy." "You don't feel like a stranger," Marcus replied, and was surprised by how true that statement was. "Emma's right. You do seem to fit." It was a simple observation, but it carried weight that both of them understood. In the space of just 2 days, Sarah Mitchell had somehow become part of the rhythm of their household, contributing to meals and conversations, and the small domestic rituals that transformed a house into a home. Whether that was good or dangerous remained to be seen, but Marcus found himself hoping it was the former. That afternoon, while Marcus worked in his shop and Sarah rested in the guest room, he could hear her talking quietly on her phone, presumably updating her supervisors on her recovery and her temporary living situation. He couldn't make out the words, but her tone suggested professional discussions, the kind of careful coordination that her work probably required. When she joined him in the workshop later, she moved with more energy than she'd shown since arriving, as if rest and regular meals were accelerating her healing in ways that hospital care hadn't managed. "Feeling better?" Marcus asked, looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding for Jack Martinez's oldest son. "Much better. The ribs are still tender, but the headaches are almost gone, and I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in weeks." She wandered around the workshop with obvious interest, examining his tools and asking intelligent questions about the various projects in different stages of completion. Marcus found himself explaining the intricacies of engine repair, with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for customers who genuinely appreciated craftsmanship. "You really love this work," Sarah observed, watching him adjust the carburetor float with micro-precise movements. "I can see it in the way you handle the tools, the attention you pay to details that other people might miss." "Engines make sense," Marcus said. "When something's broken, there's always a logical reason why, and there's usually a way to fix it. I like problems that have solutions." "What made you become a mechanic? Was it always something you wanted to do?" Marcus paused in his work, considering how to explain the path that had led him to this workshop, this life, this moment of sharing his passion with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding it. "My father taught me," he said finally. "Not professionally, he was a fire chief, but he believed that every man should know how to fix things, how to be useful with his hands. I started working on cars in high school, discovered I had a talent for diagnosing problems that stumped other people. Seemed like a good way to make a living in a town where people drive old trucks and can't afford to replace them every few years. And you never wanted to leave Pine Ridge? Try working in a bigger city where there might be more opportunities? It was the kind of question that outsiders often asked about small-town life, the assumption that ambition naturally led people toward urban centers and greater complexity. Marcus had heard variations of it before, usually from well-meaning relatives or former classmates who had moved away and couldn't understand why anyone would choose to stay. I thought about it, Marcus admitted. Rebecca and I talked about moving to Denver after we got married, maybe opening a shop that specialized in classic car restoration. But then her mother got sick, and we postponed the move to help take care of her. Then Emma was born, and Pine Ridge seemed like a better place to raise a child than the city. Then Rebecca got sick, and everything else became irrelevant. Do you regret staying? Marcus looked around his workshop, taking in the familiar chaos of tools and parts and projects that represented years of work, hundreds of satisfied customers, a reputation built one successful repair at a time. Through the window, he could see his house, where Emma would be returning from school in a few hours, where Sarah was helping to fill spaces that had been empty for too long. No, he said, and meant it completely. This is where I belong. This is home. Sarah nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant, though Marcus suspected that her nomadic professional life hadn't given her many opportunities to experience that kind of rootedness, that sense of belonging to a place and having that place belong to you in return. I envy that, she said quietly. The certainty of knowing where you fit, where you're needed. Most of my adult life has been about adapting to new places, new situations, never staying anywhere long enough to really become part of it. Maybe, Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness, it's time to try something different. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine. But something in Sarah's expression suggested that the possibility of staying in one place, of becoming part of something permanent, wasn't entirely foreign to her thinking. That evening, as they sat down to another shared meal, Marcus realized that his house was beginning to feel like a home again, filled with conversation and laughter and the comfortable presence of people who cared about each other. Whether Sarah's stay was temporary or something more remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 years, Marcus found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring today. And in the back of his mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to risk loving someone again. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Sarah had moved into the guest room. Marcus was in his workshop, rebuilding the transmission for Jenny Morrison's ancient Honda, when he heard the distinctive crunch of gravel that meant someone was pulling into his driveway. Through the grimy window, he could see a black SUV with government plates and the kind of tinted windows that suggested official business. 2 men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle, their movements carrying the particular blend of authority and alertness that marked them as federal agents. They surveyed Marcus's property with the systematic attention of professionals conducting an assessment, noting escape routes, sight lines, and potential complications, with the kind of thoroughness that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked out to meet them, aware that Sarah was somewhere in the house and hoping she would have the sense to stay out of sight until he could determine what these men wanted. Marcus Thompson? The taller of the 2 agents flashed credentials that identified him as Special Agent David Chen from the Drug Enforcement Administration. His partner, a stocky man with prematurely gray hair, introduced himself as Special Agent Rodriguez. That's right. What can I do for you, gentlemen? Agent Chen's smile was professionally pleasant, but didn't reach his eyes. We're looking for Dr. Sarah Mitchell. We understand she's been staying with you while recovering from a car accident. She is, Marcus replied carefully, trying to read the agent's intentions while revealing as little as possible about his own knowledge of Sarah's work. Is there some kind of problem? We hope not, Agent Rodriguez said, his tone suggesting that problems were exactly what he expected to find. Dr. Mitchell was supposed to report in 3 days ago, and we've been unable to reach her through normal channels. When we traced her last known location to your address, we became concerned about her welfare. It was a plausible explanation, the kind of routine check-in that might be standard procedure for federal agents working in the field. But something about the way both men carried themselves suggested this visit was about more than just welfare concerns. They moved like hunters tracking dangerous prey, not like colleagues checking on an injured teammate. "She's been recovering from her injuries," Marcus said. "Concussion, broken ribs, that sort of thing. Maybe she's just been too focused on getting better to worry about paperwork." Agent Chen nodded as if this made perfect sense, but Marcus caught the glance that passed between the two men, a look that suggested they weren't buying his explanation any more than he was buying theirs. Would it be possible to speak with Dr. Mitchell, just to confirm that she's safe, and to discuss her return to active duty? Before Marcus could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway of the house, moving with the careful posture of someone whose ribs were still healing, but whose mind was operating at full capacity. She'd clearly been listening to the conversation from inside, and her expression suggested she was no more pleased to see these agents than they were to see her. "David Rodriguez." Her greeting was professionally cordial, but noticeably lacking in warmth. "I wasn't expecting a house call." "Sarah," Agent Chen replied, and Marcus noticed that he didn't use her professional title or show any of the deference that might be expected when addressing a consultant. "We've been trying to reach you for days. Your handler is concerned about your status." "My status is exactly what I reported last week," Sarah said, moving down the porch steps with deliberate slowness. "I was injured in a car accident, I'm recovering, and I'll return to work when my doctor clears me for duty. Everything else is need to know, and neither of you needs to know." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, his body language shifting from professional courtesy to something more aggressive. "Dr. Mitchell, there have been some developments in the case you were working on before your accident. We need to debrief you on what you observed, what contacts you made, and whether your cover might have been compromised." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of the agent's words sank in. Cover compromised. This wasn't routine bureaucracy. Someone thought Sarah might be in danger, or might herself be a danger to others. And here she was, living in his house, eating meals with his daughter, becoming part of their daily routine. "My cover is fine," Sarah said flatly, "and my observations are in my preliminary report, which you should have received through normal channels. If there's something specific you need to know, you can submit a request through my handler and wait for official approval like everyone else." The tension between Sarah and the two agents was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Marcus found himself wondering about the dynamics at play. These weren't colleagues concerned about a teammate's welfare. This felt more like supervisors trying to rein in a subordinate who had gone off script. "Sarah," Agent Chen said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested strained patience, "we're not here to play bureaucratic games. There's been a leak in the operation, and 2 undercover officers have been compromised. We need to know if you made any unauthorized contacts, if you told anyone about your real purpose for being in Colorado." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized what Chen was really asking. They suspected Sarah of being the leak, and they wanted to know if she'd compromised operational security by telling him about her work with the DEA, which, of course, she had, though not in the way they probably imagined. "I haven't compromised anything," Sarah said, but Marcus caught the slight hesitation in her voice, the momentary glance in his direction that suggested she was thinking about exactly the kinds of unauthorized contacts that Chen was asking about. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a small tablet and showed Sarah what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Marcus couldn't see the images clearly from where he stood, but Sarah's reaction, a sudden stiffening of her posture, a sharp intake of breath, suggested they were significant. "Recognize anyone?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah studied the photos for a long moment before shaking her head. "Should I?" "These were taken at a truck stop about 50 miles from where you had your accident," Chen said. 3 hours before you went off the road. The man in the blue jacket is Miguel Santos, one of the targets from your investigation. The woman with him is someone we haven't identified yet, but she was asking questions about veterinarians in the area, specifically veterinarians who might be working with federal agencies." Marcus felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture that he didn't like at all. Sarah hadn't just been investigating drug operations in general. She'd been working a specific case involving specific targets, and those targets had somehow learned enough about her mission to compromise her safety. "I've never seen either of these people before," Sarah said, but there was something in her voice that suggested the photographs had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The problem, Dr. Mitchell, Agent Chen continued, is that your accident happened on a road that leads directly to the area where Santos and his associates have been operating. And now, we have 2 dead agents and a blown operation, which means someone with access to classified information has been talking to the wrong people. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the morning with implications that Marcus was only beginning to understand. These agents weren't here to check on Sarah's welfare. They were here because they suspected her of treason, of selling out her colleagues to the very criminals she was supposed to be investigating. "You think I'm working for Santos," Sarah said, and for the first time since the agents had arrived, she sounded more shocked than angry. "You actually think I'm a double agent." "We think," Rodriguez said carefully, "that someone with intimate knowledge of our operation has been feeding information to the targets. And we think that your accident might not have been as accidental as it appeared. Maybe Santos found out you were investigating him. Maybe he made you a better offer than the government did. Maybe your car went off that road because you were running from something, or towards something, and you lost control." Marcus found himself looking at Sarah with new eyes, trying to reconcile the woman who had been helping Emma with her homework and making pancakes in his kitchen, with the possibility that she might be a corrupt federal agent fleeing from her own crimes. The Sarah he knew seemed genuinely caring, authentically kind, completely committed to doing the right thing. But then again, how well did he really know her? "You're wrong," Sarah said, but Marcus caught a tremor in her voice that suggested the agent's accusations had hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. "I would never betray my colleagues, never put agents' lives at risk for money or any other reason." "Then prove it," Chen said. "Come with us now. Submit to a polygraph examination. Answer every question we ask, completely and honestly. Help us figure out how Santos knew enough about our operation to target our people." Sarah looked at Marcus, and he could see genuine fear in her gray eyes for the first time since he'd known her. Not the physical fear of someone worried about her own safety, but something deeper. The fear of someone who had been accused of the one thing that could destroy everything she believed about herself. "I need 24 hours, Sarah said finally, to get my affairs in order, to make sure my recovery is progressing properly. Then, I'll come in voluntarily and answer whatever questions you have." Agent Rodriguez shook his head. "That's not how this works, Dr. Mitchell. We have reason to believe you're a flight risk and a potential security threat. You're coming with us now, or we're placing you under arrest and taking you anyway." Marcus stepped forward before he could stop himself, his protective instincts overriding his caution about getting involved in federal law enforcement business. "Now hold on," he said, and both agents turned to look at him with the kind of attention that suggested they viewed him as either a potential ally or a potential problem. "Dr. Mitchell is recovering from serious injuries. She's been staying in my home as a guest, helping my daughter with her school project, contributing to our household. If you're going to arrest her, you better have more than suspicions and coincidences." Agent Chen's smile was cold as winter wind. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Mitchell has told you she works for the DEA, hasn't she? Has she mentioned any specifics about her assignment? Any details about the people she was investigating?" Marcus felt trapped between loyalty to Sarah and the realization that he might have inadvertently become part of something much more dangerous than he'd understood. These agents were asking questions that could implicate him as an accessory to whatever Sarah might or might not have done. "She told me she was consulting on wildlife issues related to illegal drug operations," Marcus said carefully. "Nothing beyond that." "What about the money and the gun you found in her car?" Rodriguez asked, and Marcus realized that these agents knew far more about the accident scene than he'd assumed. "Did she explain those to your satisfaction?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who was watching his response with the intensity of someone whose fate might depend on what he said next. He could see her silently pleading with him to trust her, to believe in her innocence despite the weight of evidence that seemed to be accumulating against her. "The money could have been for operational expenses," Marcus said finally. "The gun could have been for protection. People in her line of work probably need both." Agent Chen nodded as if Marcus had just confirmed something important. "And you're comfortable having someone with that much cash and firepower living in your home with your 9-year-old daughter? That doesn't concern you at all?" It was a question designed to drive a wedge between Marcus and Sarah, to force him to choose between protecting his family and supporting someone who might be lying to him about everything that mattered. Marcus felt the weight of Emma's safety pressing down on him like a physical force, reminding him that his first obligation was always to his daughter's welfare. "Dr. Mitchell has been nothing but kind and helpful since she's been staying with us," Marcus said, trying to thread the needle between honesty and loyalty. "My dog trusts her, my daughter likes her, and I've seen no evidence of any kind of dangerous or deceptive behavior." "Dogs and children can be fooled, Mr. Thompson," Rodriguez said. "Professional criminals are often very good at appearing trustworthy when it serves their purposes." Sarah stepped forward, her face pale, but her voice steady. "Marcus, you don't have to defend me to these people. They've already made up their minds about my guilt, and nothing you say is going to change that." She turned to face the agents directly, her posture straightening despite her healing injuries. "I'll come with you voluntarily, answer your questions, take your polygraph test. But I want it on record that I'm cooperating fully, and that Mr. Thompson and his family had nothing to do with any aspect of my work." "That remains to be seen," Chen said, but Marcus caught the slight relaxation in his shoulders that suggested Sarah's cooperation had diffused some of the immediate tension. As Sarah went inside to pack her belongings, Marcus found himself alone with the two agents, both of whom were studying him with the calculating attention of professionals trying to determine whether he was naive, complicit, or simply unlucky. "Mr. Thompson," Agent Rodriguez said, his tone shifting to something that might have been sympathy, "I want you to understand that Dr. Mitchell is suspected of serious federal crimes. If she's been using your home and your family as a cover for illegal activities, you could be charged as an accessory. I'd strongly recommend that you distance yourself from her situation and cooperate fully with our investigation." The threat was clear, wrapped in language that sounded like helpful advice, but carried implications that could destroy Marcus's life and Emma's future. These agents had the power to turn his simple act of helping an injured stranger into a federal case that could cost him everything he'd worked to build. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus asked. "I'm advising you," Chen replied. "Sometimes good people get caught up in bad situations because they trust the wrong person at the wrong time. We don't want to see that happen to you or your daughter." When Sarah emerged from the house 20 minutes later, carrying her single suitcase and moving with the careful dignity of someone who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond her control, Marcus felt something twist in his chest that might have been heartbreak, or might have been the recognition that the brief period of happiness he'd allowed himself was ending as abruptly as it had begun. "Thank you," Sarah said to Marcus, her gray eyes holding his for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "For everything, for the rescue, for the kindness, for giving me a glimpse of what a real home feels like. I'll never forget it." "Sarah," Marcus said, but she shook her head. "Don't say anything else. These men will use whatever you say against both of us. Just take care of Emma and remember that not everything you hear about me is going to be true." Agent Chen opened the rear door of the black SUV, and Sarah climbed in with the resigned grace of someone who had always known this moment would come. As the vehicle pulled out of Marcus's driveway, leaving tracks in the gravel that would remain visible for days, Marcus found himself wondering if he'd just watched an innocent woman being railroaded by federal agents who needed a scapegoat, or if he'd been harboring a dangerous criminal who had manipulated his family's kindness for her own purposes. The only thing he knew for certain was that Emma would be heartbroken when she came home from school to find that their house guest had disappeared without saying goodbye, taking with her the promise of help with the wildlife project and the warm presence that had made their house feel like a complete home again. Marcus stood in his driveway long after the SUV had disappeared, staring at the empty space where government authority had intersected with his carefully ordered life and changed everything in ways he was only beginning to understand. Ranger appeared beside him, whining softly as if he too sensed that something important had been lost, something that might not be easily recovered. Inside the house, the guest room sat empty once again, its quilted bedspread smooth and undisturbed, as if Sarah Mitchell had never existed at all. But the kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee she'd made that morning, and Emma's wildlife project lay half-finished on the dining room table, a reminder of promises that would now go unfulfilled. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Thompson felt truly alone, and he couldn't decide whether that was a return to familiar safety or a descent into a loneliness that Sarah's brief presence had made unbearable by comparison. Ekmalasitisied. 3 days passed in a haze of unanswered questions and mounting dread. Marcus went through the motions of his daily routine, fixing engines, picking Emma up from school, preparing meals that neither of them had much appetite for. But his mind remained fixed on Sarah's last words and the implications of everything he'd witnessed during her arrest. Emma had taken Sarah's sudden departure harder than Marcus had expected. She'd come home from school that Tuesday afternoon, bubbling with excitement about showing their house guest the pictures she'd drawn of Colorado elk, only to find the guest room empty and her father wearing the same hollow expression he'd carried for months after her mother's funeral. "Where did Sarah go?" Emma asked, standing in the doorway of the empty room with tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "She promised to help me finish my wildlife project." Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level, struggling to find words that would explain federal investigations and criminal accusations to a 9-year-old who had simply enjoyed having another woman in the house. "She had to go back to work, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have responsibilities that take them away from the people they care about." "But she didn't say goodbye," Emma said, and the hurt in her voice cut through Marcus like a blade. "She said she would help me, and then she just left." Marcus gathered his daughter in his arms, feeling the familiar weight of being the only parent available to comfort a child's disappointment. In the 3 years since Rebecca's death, he'd become skilled at providing explanations for inexplicable losses, but that didn't make the process any easier. "Sometimes people have to leave quickly because of their jobs," Marcus said softly. "That doesn't mean they wanted to go, or that they didn't care about us. It just means that grown-up life is complicated in ways that don't always make sense." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus found himself wondering if Sarah's departure really had been as involuntary as he'd assumed. The federal agents had presented evidence that suggested she might be involved in criminal activity. And while Marcus's instincts told him that the woman who had made pancakes with Emma couldn't possibly be a corrupt federal agent, he was beginning to question whether his instincts could be trusted when it came to matters this serious. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed with her homework unfinished and her usual bedtime story replaced by quiet sniffling, Marcus found himself staring at his phone and debating whether to call the DEA field office to ask about Sarah's status. He had no legal right to information about an ongoing federal investigation, but the need to know what had happened to her was becoming impossible to ignore. Before he could decide, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Marcus, it's Sarah." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and there was something about the quality of the connection that suggested she was calling from a location where privacy couldn't be guaranteed. "Sarah, where are you? Are you all right? Emma's been asking about you." "I'm fine. I'm at a federal facility in Denver, undergoing what they euphemistically call debriefing." "Listen to me carefully, Marcus. I don't have much time, and there are things you need to know." Marcus felt his heart rate spike as the implications of Sarah's clandestine phone call sank in. If she was calling him from federal custody without authorization, she was taking enormous risks that suggested her situation was more desperate than the agents had implied. "What kind of things?" "The agents who came to your house, Chen and Rodriguez, they're not really DEA. They're working for the same people I was investigating, and they took me to find out what I know and who I've told." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet as Sarah's words rearranged everything he thought he understood about the previous week's events. The federal agents hadn't been investigating corruption. They had been the corruption, using official credentials to neutralize a threat to their criminal enterprise. "What are you saying? Are you telling me that federal agents kidnapped you?" "I'm telling you that the line between law enforcement and organized crime isn't as clear as most people think," Sarah said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had learned terrible truths about institutions she'd once trusted. "The drug operation I was investigating has connections that reach into federal agencies, local law enforcement, even some elected officials. When I got too close to the truth, they decided to eliminate the threat." Marcus sank into his kitchen chair, trying to process information that challenged everything he'd believed about government authority and the rule of law. If Sarah was telling the truth, then he'd witnessed a kidnapping disguised as an arrest, carried out by criminals wearing federal badges. "How do I know you're telling me the truth?" Marcus asked, hating himself for the question, but needing to voice the doubt that had been growing since the agent's visit. How do I know you're not the corrupt one, trying to manipulate me into helping you escape justice? Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. You don't know, Marcus. That's the genius of what they've done. They've created enough doubt and confusion that nobody knows who to trust. But I'll tell you this. If I were really working for drug dealers, would I have spent a week making pancakes with your daughter and helping her with homework? Would I have risked exposure by getting close to your family? It was a compelling argument, but Marcus had learned enough about criminal psychology to know that sociopaths could be remarkably skilled at mimicking normal human emotions when it served their purposes. Then why are you calling me? What do you want me to do? I want you to protect Emma and yourself, Sarah said urgently. Chen and Rodriguez know that I told you about my work, which means they consider you a potential security risk. They're going to come back, Marcus, and when they do, they won't be as polite as they were during their first visit. Marcus felt ice crystals forming in his veins as the full implications of Sarah's warning became clear. If she was right about the agent's true identity, then his family had become collateral damage in a war between federal investigators and the criminals they were trying to catch. What should I do? Take Emma and leave Pine Ridge tonight. Don't pack anything that would suggest you're not coming back. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't use credit cards or cell phones once you're on the road. Drive to Colorado Springs and check into a hotel under a false name. I'll contact you there when I can. Marcus looked around his kitchen, taking in the familiar details of a life that Sarah was telling him to abandon without warning or explanation. The stack of bills on the counter, the school papers Emma had left on the table, the coffee mug Rebecca had given him for his birthday 8 years ago. All of it would have to be left behind if he followed Sarah's advice. I can't just disappear, Marcus said. I have customers depending on me. Emma has school. We have a life here. You're asking me to give up everything based on the word of someone I've known for less than 2 weeks. I'm asking you to save your daughter's life, Sarah said, and the desperation in her voice cut through Marcus's resistance like a knife through paper. These people don't leave loose ends, Marcus. They don't take chances with witnesses who might be able to connect them to federal crimes. If you stay in Pine Ridge, you're going to end up like the 2 agents who were killed before my arrest, dead, with your murder disguised as an accident. The line went quiet except for the sound of Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow, with what might have been fear or exhaustion or both. Marcus could hear voices in the background, indistinct but authoritative, and he realized that her unauthorized phone call was probably about to be discovered. I have to go, Sarah whispered. Remember what I told you. Trust no one in law enforcement and get Emma somewhere safe. I'll find you when this is over. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone and trying to decide whether he'd just received a warning that could save his life or been manipulated by a desperate criminal who was trying to use his feelings for her to aid in her escape. Ranger appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of Marcus's distressed voice, and settled beside his master's chair with the patient loyalty of an animal who understood that humans sometimes needed comfort they couldn't ask for directly. Marcus scratched behind the German shepherd's ears, drawing strength from the unconditional trust in his dog's dark eyes. What do you think, boy? Marcus asked softly. Should we trust her? Ranger's tail wagged once, the same measured response he'd given when Marcus had first asked about Sarah. But this time, Marcus thought he detected genuine concern in his dog's expression, as if the animal sensed dangers that human perception couldn't identify. Marcus spent the next hour sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills and trying to weigh the relative risks of staying versus leaving. If Sarah was telling the truth, then remaining in Pine Ridge would put Emma in mortal danger. If she was lying, then fleeing would destroy everything he'd worked to build while branding him as a fugitive from federal justice. The decision was made for him at 11:30 that night, when Ranger's sharp bark woke him from the light doze he'd fallen into while wrestling with impossible choices. Through his bedroom window, Marcus could see headlights moving slowly down Maple Creek Road, the kind of careful approach that suggested someone was conducting surveillance rather than simply driving home from a late night out. Marcus slipped out of bed and moved to the window, staying in the shadows as he watched a dark sedan park across the street from his house. The vehicle's occupants didn't get out, but the red glow of cigarettes in the darkness suggested at least 2 people were maintaining watch on his property. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind as Marcus realized that his decision had been made for him. Whatever the truth about federal corruption and criminal conspiracies, armed men were watching his house at midnight, and that was reason enough to assume that Emma's safety was compromised. Moving as quietly as possible, Marcus gathered the emergency supplies that Rebecca had insisted they keep in the hall closet: cash, first aid kit, bottled water, and the camping gear that might be necessary if they had to avoid motels and hotels. He packed a single suitcase with clothes for himself and Emma, trying to choose items that would be practical for extended travel without revealing that they were planning to disappear. The hardest part was waking Emma without alarming her, explaining that they needed to leave immediately without providing details that would terrify a 9-year-old. Marcus settled on a story about an emergency call from Uncle Robert in Colorado Springs, a fictional crisis that required their immediate presence but didn't suggest that they were fleeing from danger. "Do we have to go right now?" Emma asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she climbed into her clothes in the darkness. "Can't we wait until morning?" "Uncle Robert needs us tonight, sweetheart," Marcus said, hating the lie, but knowing that the truth would be worse. Sometimes families have to help each other, even when it's not convenient. Emma accepted this explanation with the trusting faith that children show their parents, gathering her stuffed rabbit and a few favorite books, without questioning why they were leaving their home in the middle of the night. Ranger seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, moving silently through the house and positioning himself near the front door, as if ready to defend his family against whatever threats the darkness might contain. Marcus loaded their supplies into his truck as quietly as possible, using the workshop as cover to avoid being seen by whoever was conducting surveillance from the street. The Ford's engine seemed impossibly loud when he started it, the rumble echoing through the sleeping neighborhood like an announcement of their escape attempt. As they pulled out of the driveway, Marcus caught a glimpse of the surveillance vehicle in his rearview mirror. The sedan's headlights came on immediately, following at a distance that confirmed his worst fears about the watcher's intentions. They weren't just monitoring his movements, they were prepared to pursue him if he tried to leave. "Daddy, why is that car following us?" Emma asked, her 9-year-old perception cutting straight to the heart of the situation, despite Marcus's attempts to make their departure seem routine. "Sometimes people drive the same direction we do," Marcus said, but his hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel as he tried to plan an escape route that would lose their pursuers without endangering his daughter. The chase that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out on dark mountain roads, where a single mistake could send his truck tumbling into ravines that would swallow his family without trace. The sedan stayed with them through switchbacks and straightaways, its driver displaying the kind of professional skill that suggested military or law enforcement training. Marcus used every advantage his local knowledge provided, taking shortcuts through Forest Service roads and abandoned mining tracks that weren't marked on standard maps. But their pursuers seemed to have their own advantages, possibly including real-time tracking that allowed them to anticipate Marcus's movements even when he managed to temporarily break visual contact. The chase might have continued until dawn, or until Marcus's truck ran out of gas, if not for the intervention of what could only be described as divine providence. A Colorado State police cruiser, conducting routine patrol on Highway 285, happened to witness what appeared to be a high-speed pursuit involving civilian vehicles. The trooper's presence forced the sedan to break off its pursuit, disappearing into the network of back roads that connected Pine Ridge to the larger world. Marcus found himself being questioned by a law enforcement officer who seemed genuinely concerned about citizen safety rather than interested in covering up federal crimes. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell me why someone was chasing you and your daughter at midnight?" Trooper Williams asked, his tone carrying the professional courtesy of a police officer who dealt with domestic disputes and criminal activity on a regular basis. Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching the conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child, who was beginning to understand that their midnight drive wasn't really about helping Uncle Robert. How could he explain federal corruption and drug conspiracies to a state trooper without sounding like a paranoid conspiracy theorist? "I think we may have been targeted because of someone who was staying at our house," Marcus said carefully. "A federal agent who was investigating local drug operations. Some people might think we know more than we actually do." Trooper Williams nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, which suggested that he'd encountered similar situations before. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to recommend that you and your daughter find somewhere safe to stay tonight, somewhere away from Pine Ridge. I'll file a report about the pursuit, But if there are federal crimes involved, this is going to get complicated quickly. It was exactly the kind of advice that Sarah had given him over the phone, confirmation from an independent source that his family's safety required immediate relocation. Marcus thanked the trooper and continued driving toward Colorado Springs, checking his rearview mirror every few minutes to make sure they weren't being followed. They reached the city at 3 in the morning, tired and frightened, but alive. Marcus used cash to check into a budget motel under the name Robert Thompson, claiming to be traveling to visit relatives and needing a room for just one night. The desk clerk, accustomed to unusual requests from travelers passing through Colorado Springs, asked no questions and provided no information that could be used to track their location. As Emma fell asleep in one of the motel's twin beds, clutching her stuffed rabbit and exhausted by the night's events, Marcus sat by the window and tried to process everything that had happened since Sarah's arrest. 3 days ago, he'd been a small-town mechanic whose biggest concern was paying the monthly bills. Now he was a fugitive from what might or might not be federal justice, hiding in a cheap motel with his daughter while armed men searched for them with unknown intentions. The worst part was the uncertainty, the fact that he still didn't know whether Sarah Mitchell was a hero or a villain, whether her warnings had saved his life or manipulated him into becoming an accessory to federal crimes. All he knew for certain was that Emma was safe for now, and that tomorrow would bring new challenges that he'd have to face without the support system that Pine Ridge had provided. Ranger lay across the threshold of the motel room, his position chosen to defend against threats from the hallway while keeping watch over the family he'd sworn to protect. In the darkness, Marcus could see the German Shepherd's eyes reflecting the neon light from the parking lot, alert and vigilant despite the exhaustion that they all felt. "Good boy," Marcus whispered, reaching down to scratch behind Ranger's ears. "We're going to figure this out somehow." But as he finally drifted off to sleep in the uncomfortable motel chair, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come, that fleeing Pine Ridge had been only the first move in a game whose rules he didn't understand and whose stakes included everything he cared about in the world. Outside, the Colorado Springs skyline glittered with lights that represented thousands of families sleeping peacefully in their own beds, unaware that federal corruption and criminal conspiracies were real forces that could shatter ordinary lives without warning or explanation. Marcus envied them their ignorance, their faith in institutions that he was no longer certain deserved trust. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to contact Sarah, whether to trust law enforcement, whether to keep running or make a stand. Tonight, all he could do was hold his daughter close and pray that whatever choices he made would be enough to keep her safe in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. The truth, whatever it turned out to be, would have to wait until morning. Right now, survival was the only priority that mattered, and even that felt like a luxury that might not last much longer. Yosse de Boer. Marcus woke to the sound of Emma crying in the bathroom of their cheap motel room, quiet sobs that she was trying to muffle with a towel so she wouldn't wake her father. Through the thin walls, he could hear the rumble of highway traffic and the voices of other travelers beginning their day. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives that felt like echoes from a world he could no longer access. It was their third day in Colorado Springs, 3 days of living out of suitcases and eating fast food, while Marcus tried to figure out their next move. His cash reserves were dwindling faster than he'd anticipated, and Emma's questions about when they could go home were becoming harder to deflect with vague promises about Uncle Robert's fictional emergency. "Sweetheart?" Marcus knocked gently on the bathroom door. "Are you okay?" Emma opened the door, her face streaked with tears and her dark hair tangled from a restless night's sleep. At 9 years old, she was old enough to understand that their situation was more serious than her father had initially suggested, but young enough to feel helpless in the face of circumstances beyond her control. "I want to go home, Daddy," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist with desperate intensity. "I want to sleep in my own bed and see my friends and finish my wildlife project. Why can't we just go home?" Marcus felt his heart break a little more as he held his daughter, feeling the weight of her confusion and fear pressing against his chest like a physical force. For 3 days, he'd been telling himself that he was protecting Emma by keeping her away from Pine Ridge, but watching her dissolve into tears in a dingy motel bathroom made him wonder if the cure was worse than the disease. "I know you want to go home," Marcus said softly, carrying Emma back to her bed and sitting beside her, while Ranger settled protectively at their feet. "Daddy wants that too, but sometimes we have to stay away from home to keep safe, even when it's hard and we don't understand why." "Safe from what?" Emma asked, her 9-year-old directness cutting through Marcus's careful evasions. "What are we hiding from? And don't say Uncle Robert, because I know that's not real. Tommy Morrison's dad works at the phone company, and he says Uncle Robert's number goes to a pizza place in Denver." Marcus closed his eyes, realizing that his daughter was too smart and too observant to be fooled by the transparent fiction he'd constructed. Pine Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's family connections, and Emma had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence along with her stubborn insistence on truth. "We're hiding from some bad people who think we know something that could get them in trouble," Marcus said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Remember Dr. Mitchell, our house guest? The work she was doing made some dangerous people angry, and they think we might be able to help the police catch them." Emma considered this explanation with the seriousness that children bring to adult mysteries that suddenly affect their own lives. "Are the bad people going to hurt us?" "Not if I can help it," Marcus said, though he was far from certain that his determination would be enough to protect them from enemies with federal resources and government authority. "That's why we're staying away from home, so the bad people can't find us." "But what about school? What about my friends? What about Ranger's food?" Emma's questions were practical and immediate, focusing on the tangible losses that their flight had created. "Mrs. Patterson is probably wondering why I haven't been feeding the class hamster." Marcus felt a fresh wave of guilt as he realized how many ordinary responsibilities they had abandoned in their hasty departure. Emma's teacher would be concerned about her absence. Customers would be wondering why his workshop was closed. Neighbors would notice that his truck was gone and his house was dark. Their sudden disappearance would create exactly the kind of attention that might help their enemies track their location. "I'll call the school and explain that you're sick," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure how long that excuse would be credible. "And Mrs. Patterson will understand about the hamster." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew they were facing a problem with no easy solution. They couldn't stay in Colorado Springs indefinitely, living off his dwindling cash reserves and Emma's rapidly depleting patience. But they couldn't return to Pine Ridge without risking whatever danger had forced them to flee in the first place. The decision was made for him later that morning when his phone rang with a call from Sheriff Bradley Morrison, Tommy's father, and the chief law enforcement officer in Pine Ridge. "Marcus, thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the kind of urgency that suggested official business rather than friendly concern, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with dread as he realized that their situation had somehow escalated beyond his ability to manage it quietly. "What's wrong, Sheriff?" "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Marcus. There are federal agents crawling all over Pine Ridge asking questions about you and Emma. They are claiming you're wanted for questioning in connection with a terrorism investigation, and they have warrants to search your property." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet as the implications of Sheriff Morrison's words sank in. Terrorism investigation, federal warrants. The shadowy enemies that Sarah had warned him about weren't just pursuing him. They were using the full authority of the federal government to justify their hunt. "Terrorism? Sheriff, I'm a mechanic. I fix trucks and lawnmowers. What could I possibly have to do with terrorism?" "I don't know, and that's what worries me," Morrison replied. "These agents are asking about Dr. Mitchell, about what she told you, about whether you helped her communicate with anyone outside law enforcement channels. They're treating you like a person of interest in a federal case, Marcus." Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching his side of the conversation with growing alarm, and realized that Sarah's warning about government corruption had been accurate in ways he was only beginning to understand. The people hunting them weren't just criminal impersonators. They were criminals who had infiltrated legitimate agencies and were using federal authority to cover their tracks. "Sheriff, I need you to listen to me carefully," Marcus said, moving to the window to check the motel parking lot for signs of surveillance. "Those agents aren't really federal law enforcement. They're working for the same drug operation that Dr. Mitchell was investigating, and they're using fake credentials to eliminate witnesses." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Sheriff Morrison spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of a law enforcement officer who was trying to determine whether he was talking to a victim or a suspect. Marcus, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to support what you're saying? Dr. Mitchell called me 3 nights ago from federal custody and warned me that the agents who arrested her weren't really DEA. She said the drug operation has connections inside government agencies, and that Emma and I were in danger because we know about her investigation. And you believed her? It was a reasonable question, the kind that any rational person would ask when confronted with conspiracy theories that challenge basic assumptions about government integrity. Marcus found himself struggling to explain why he'd trusted Sarah's midnight phone call over the official credentials that Chen and Rodriguez had displayed. "Sheriff, armed men have been watching my house at night. Someone chased us when we left Pine Ridge, chased us with the kind of professional skill that suggests military training. These aren't random criminals. They're organized, well-funded, and they have access to federal resources." "Or," Sheriff Morrison said gently, "you're a frightened father who's been manipulated by a federal suspect into believing conspiracy theories that justify running from legitimate law enforcement." The possibility hung between them like a loaded gun, forcing Marcus to confront the reality that his version of events might sound paranoid and delusional to anyone who hadn't experienced them firsthand. How could he prove that federal agents were actually criminals? How could he demonstrate that government authority was being used to cover up crimes rather than solve them? "Sheriff, all I know is that my daughter and I were safe until we helped Dr. Mitchell, and now we're fugitives hiding in a motel because armed men are hunting us. Whether those men are legitimate federal agents or criminal impersonators doesn't change the fact that Emma's life is in danger." Sheriff Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background, as if the lawman was reviewing files or reports while considering his response. "Marcus, I've known you since you were Emma's age. I knew your father, and I knew Rebecca. You're not the kind of man who gets involved with federal crimes or international conspiracies. But I also know that good people sometimes make bad decisions when they're trying to help someone they care about." The implication was clear. Sheriff Morrison believed that Marcus had been seduced by Sarah Mitchell into aiding and abetting federal crimes, that his feelings for her had clouded his judgment and led him to make choices that endangered his daughter's welfare. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" "I'm saying that you need to come home, Marcus. You need to bring Emma back to Pine Ridge and cooperate with the federal investigation. Running makes you look guilty, and looking guilty makes it harder for people like me to help you when this gets sorted out." Marcus looked at Emma, who was sitting on her motel bed with Ranger's head in her lap, both of them watching him with the kind of attention that suggested they understood their fate was being decided by this conversation. "And if the federal agents really are criminals, if coming home means walking into a trap that gets my daughter killed, then I'll protect you," Sheriff Morrison said, with the conviction of a man who had spent his career believing that law enforcement existed to serve and protect rather than to deceive and destroy. "Marcus, I'm the sheriff of Pine Ridge County. Whatever federal crimes you might or might not have committed, you're still under my protection as long as you're in my jurisdiction." It was an appealing offer, the promise of safety backed by local authority and personal friendship. But Marcus remembered the professional skill of their pursuers, the casual way Chen and Rodriguez had threatened his family, the resources that seemed to be available to people who wanted him silenced. "Sheriff, if these people have federal credentials and unlimited resources, what makes you think you can protect us?" "Because I know every road in and out of Pine Ridge," Morrison replied. "I know every hiding place in the mountains, every family that would take you in if you needed shelter, and most importantly, I know the difference between right and wrong, regardless of what badges people are wearing." The offer was tempting, the promise of returning to familiar territory, where allies outnumbered enemies and local knowledge might provide advantages that couldn't be matched by federal resources. But Marcus couldn't shake Sarah's warning about trusting law enforcement, her insistence that the corruption reached levels that made traditional protection meaningless. "I need time to think about it," Marcus said finally. "You don't have time, Marcus. Every hour you stay away makes the situation worse. The federal agents are expanding their search, bringing in more resources, treating Pine Ridge like a crime scene. Pretty soon, they're going to start questioning everyone who's ever spoken to you, including Emma's teachers and her friends' parents." The threat was implicit but clear. Marcus's continued absence would bring federal scrutiny to innocent people who had no connection to whatever crimes he was suspected of committing. His neighbors and friends would be subjected to the kind of investigation that could destroy reputations and relationships, all because he had chosen to trust a woman who might or might not be telling him the truth. 24 hours, Marcus said. Give me 24 hours to figure out what's really going on, and then I'll make a decision about coming home. Marcus, 24 hours, Sheriff, and if federal agents show up at Emma's school or start questioning her friends, I'll know that your promise of protection isn't worth the breath it took to make it. Marcus ended the call before Sheriff Morrison could respond, leaving himself and Emma alone with the impossible choice between trusting law enforcement that might be corrupt and continuing to run from enemies who seemed to have unlimited resources for pursuing them. Emma had been listening to his side of the conversation with the sharp attention of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for signs of impending disaster. Are we going home, Daddy? I don't know yet, sweetheart. It's complicated. Everything's been complicated since Sarah left, Emma said, with 9-year-old wisdom that cut straight to the heart of their situation. Maybe we should never have helped her. Marcus felt a stab of guilt as he realized that his daughter was probably right. Their problems had begun the moment they had stopped to help an injured stranger, and every decision since then had led them deeper into a maze of federal crimes and government corruption that threatened to destroy everything they cared about. But he also remembered Sarah's face when she'd talked about Emma's happiness, the genuine affection she'd shown for his daughter, the way she'd fit into their household routines as if she'd always belonged there. Whatever else Sarah Mitchell might be, she wasn't someone who would deliberately endanger a child for personal gain. That afternoon, while Emma napped and Ranger maintained his vigilant watch over their motel room, Marcus made a decision that would either save his family or destroy them completely. He called the number Sarah had given him before her arrest, a contact that she'd claimed would connect him to her handler in the legitimate DEA hierarchy. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered with professional briskness. Agent Jennifer Walsh, DEA Internal Affairs Division. How can I help you? Marcus felt a surge of hope as he realized that Sarah's contact was real, that there might indeed be legitimate federal agents who could distinguish between law enforcement and criminal conspiracy. Agent Walsh, my name is Marcus Thompson. I think Dr. Sarah Mitchell mentioned me to you. The silence that followed was long enough to make Marcus wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake by revealing his identity to someone who might be working with his enemies. Mr. Thompson, Agent Walsh said finally, where are you calling from? Are you and your daughter safe? The relief in her voice suggested genuine concern rather than the calculating interest of someone trying to locate fugitives, and Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as he realized that Sarah had indeed been working with legitimate federal authorities. We're safe for now, but Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez told me that Sarah was suspected of being a double agent. They arrested her and took her away for questioning. Mr. Thompson, there are no agents named Chen and Rodriguez in the DEA. Whoever took Dr. Mitchell was not working for the federal government. We've been trying to locate her for 4 days, ever since she missed her scheduled contact with our office. Marcus felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture that confirmed Sarah's warnings, while validating his decision to trust her over the men who had claimed federal authority. So, Sarah was telling the truth about the corruption, about the danger to my family? Dr. Mitchell was working deep undercover to investigate a drug operation with connections to corrupt federal agents, Agent Walsh confirmed. Her cover was blown by someone inside our own organization, and the people she was investigating have been trying to eliminate her ever since. By helping her, you and your daughter became targets for the same people who want her dead. It was the confirmation Marcus had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Sarah was innocent, but that innocence came with implications that made their situation even more dangerous than he'd feared. What should I do? How do I protect Emma? Come in, Mr. Thompson. Bring your daughter to Denver and let us provide official protection while we sort this out. We have safe houses, resources, the ability to keep you secure while we investigate the people who have been hunting you. Marcus looked at Emma, still sleeping peacefully, despite the chaos that surrounded their lives, and realized that Agent Walsh was offering exactly what he'd been hoping for: legitimate federal protection backed by real authority and genuine resources. But Sarah's warning about trusting law enforcement echoed in his mind, reminding him that corruption could reach levels that made even Internal Affairs Division suspect. How could he be certain that Agent Walsh was really who she claimed to be? How could he trust federal protection when federal credentials had been used to justify hunting his family? "I need to think about it," Marcus said. "Mr. Thompson, every hour you delay gives the people hunting you more time to find your location. We can have agents in Colorado Springs within 2 hours, agents who can verify their identity and escort you to safety. Don't let paranoia prevent you from accepting help when you need it most." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone and trying to decide whether he'd just spoken to a federal agent who could save his life or a criminal who was using his desperation to lure him into a trap. Outside their motel room window, the Colorado Springs skyline stretched toward mountains that promised freedom for those brave enough to disappear into their wilderness embrace. Marcus had 23 hours left to decide whether to trust federal authority or take his chances with whatever sanctuary the high country might provide. Either way, the decision would determine whether Emma grew up with her father or grew up an orphan, whether their family survived this crisis or became another casualty in a war between law enforcement and the criminals who had learned to wear badges while serving masters other than justice. The truth was out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. The question was whether Marcus and Emma would live long enough to find it. The decision came to Marcus in the early hours of dawn, as he sat by the motel window, watching the parking lot for signs of surveillance while Emma slept peacefully in the bed behind him. Ranger had been restless all night, pacing between the door and the window with the kind of agitation that suggested the German Shepherd sensed approaching danger through channels that human perception couldn't access. It wasn't Agent Walsh's phone call that convinced him to trust federal protection, though her confirmation of Sarah's legitimate status had been reassuring. It wasn't Sheriff Morrison's promise of local sanctuary, though the appeal of returning to familiar territory remained strong. The deciding factor was much simpler and infinitely more powerful: the sight of his 9-year-old daughter's face, pale with exhaustion and streaked with the remnants of tears she'd tried to hide from him. Emma had been patient beyond her years, accepting their nomadic existence with the resilience that children show when the adults they trust tell them it's necessary. But Marcus could see the toll that constant uncertainty was taking on her. The way she flinched at unexpected sounds, the questions she'd stopped asking because she'd learned that the answers only made things more frightening. He was failing her, not through malice or neglect, but through his inability to provide the stability and security that every child deserved. Running had been a necessary response to immediate danger, but it wasn't a sustainable strategy for protecting his daughter's future. Emma needed more than survival. She needed a life worth living, and that required taking risks that might end in tragedy, but offered the possibility of genuine resolution. At 6 a.m, Marcus made 2 phone calls that would determine the trajectory of their lives. The first was to Agent Walsh, accepting her offer of federal protection and agreeing to meet her team at a secure location in Denver. The second was to Sheriff Morrison, informing him that they would be returning to Colorado, but not to Pine Ridge, and asking him to keep their house and property secure until the federal investigation was concluded. "You're making the right choice, Marcus," Agent Walsh said when he called to arrange their surrender to federal protection. "We have a safe house prepared, and Dr. Mitchell is eager to see you and Emma again." The mention of Sarah sent a surge of unexpected emotion through Marcus's chest: relief, anticipation, and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. For 3 days he'd been wondering whether she was alive or dead, whether her warnings had been truth or manipulation, whether the connection he'd felt between them had been genuine or simply the product of his own loneliness. "She's all right?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally, she's been very worried about you and your daughter. She blames herself for involving your family in a situation that should have remained contained within law enforcement channels." Marcus understood that guilt, the weight of knowing that your choices had endangered innocent people who deserved better than to become collateral damage in other people's wars. He'd been carrying similar guilt since the moment they'd fled Pine Ridge, wondering if his decision to help Sarah had been an act of compassion or simply a selfish desire for connection that had put Emma at risk. The meeting was arranged for noon at a federal building in downtown Denver, a sterile government facility that represented the kind of institutional authority Marcus had learned to distrust over the past week. but Agent Walsh provided verification codes and contact numbers that could be checked through independent channels, bureaucratic safeguards that suggested legitimate federal involvement rather than criminal impersonation. The drive to Denver passed in relative silence, with Emma dozing in the passenger seat and Ranger maintaining his vigilant watch from the truck bed. Marcus found himself thinking about Rebecca, wondering what his wife would have advised in this situation. She'd always been better at reading people's motivations, at distinguishing between those who could be trusted and those who presented dangers disguised as opportunities. "She would have told you to trust your heart," Rebecca's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, carrying the warmth and wisdom that had guided their marriage through 13 years of shared joy and sorrow. "She would have reminded you that love is always a risk worth taking, especially when it offers the possibility of protecting someone else's child." The federal building was an imposing structure of glass and concrete that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. But Agent Walsh met them in the lobby with credentials that checked out, and a team of agents who treated Emma with the kind of gentle courtesy that suggested genuine concern for her welfare. Marcus found himself studying their faces, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas, but seeing only professional competence and what appeared to be authentic dedication to protecting innocent civilians. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for trusting us with your family's safety," Agent Walsh said, as she escorted them through security checkpoints and into an elevator that required special clearance to operate. "I know this hasn't been easy, and I want you to know that we take our responsibility for your protection very seriously." The safe house was located on the building's 15th floor, a comfortable apartment with reinforced windows and electronic security that could house a small family indefinitely if necessary. But it was the person waiting in the living room that made Marcus's heart skip a beat and brought tears to Emma's eyes. Sarah Mitchell sat on the couch looking thinner and more tired than when Marcus had last seen her. But her smile was radiant as Emma ran across the room and threw herself into her arms with the enthusiasm of a child, greeting a beloved relative who had been feared lost forever. "I thought the bad men hurt you," Emma said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder as she clung to the woman who had promised to help with her wildlife project, and then disappeared without explanation. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her own voice thick with emotion as she held Emma close. "I'm so sorry I had to leave without saying goodbye. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that don't make sense to children, but that doesn't mean we stop caring about the people who matter to us." Marcus stood in the doorway watching the reunion, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that he wasn't sure he was ready to examine. Relief that Sarah was alive and apparently unharmed. Gratitude that Emma's faith in their former houseguest hadn't been misplaced. And something deeper, warmer, more dangerous. The recognition that seeing Sarah again felt like coming home in ways that had nothing to do with geography, and everything to do with the heart's stubborn insistence on connection, despite the risks involved. "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said, looking up at him over Emma's head with gray eyes that held apology, gratitude, and what might have been hope. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused your family." "You warned us," Marcus replied, moving into the room and settling into a chair across from them. "If you hadn't called that night, we might not have gotten away before they came for us." Agent Walsh cleared her throat, reminding them that their reunion was taking place under federal supervision, and that personal matters would have to be balanced against the requirements of an ongoing investigation. "Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson, I know you have a lot to discuss, but we need to debrief both of you about what you've experienced over the past week. The information you can provide might be crucial to identifying the people who have been hunting you and bringing them to justice." The debriefing lasted for 3 hours, with Marcus and Sarah taking turns to describe their experiences with the fake federal agents, the surveillance of Marcus's property, the midnight chase that had forced them to flee Pine Ridge, and the various contacts they'd made with law enforcement officials who might or might not have been legitimate. As their stories emerged, a picture began to form of a sophisticated criminal organization that had infiltrated multiple levels of government using federal credentials and official resources to protect a drug operation that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. The corruption reached high enough to compromise some federal investigations while leaving others, like Agent Walsh's Internal Affairs Division, unaware of the scope of the problem they were facing. "The good news," Agent Walsh said as the formal debriefing concluded, is that your information corroborates intelligence we've been gathering from other sources. We're close to making arrests that should shut down the entire operation." "And the bad news?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The bad news is that until we can make those arrests, you and your family remain at risk. The people hunting you have invested too much in eliminating witnesses to give up now. They'll keep looking until they find you, or until we put them in prison." Emma had fallen asleep on the couch beside Sarah during the latter part of the debriefing, exhausted by the emotional intensity of their reunion and the accumulated stress of a week spent living as fugitives. Sarah was stroking her hair with the unconscious tenderness of someone who genuinely cared about the child's welfare, and Marcus found himself wondering what it would be like to make such gestures part of their daily routine. "How long?" Marcus asked. "How long before this is resolved?" "Days, maybe weeks," Agent Walsh replied. "We're coordinating with multiple agencies, building cases that will stand up in federal court. This isn't the kind of operation that can be rushed without risking everything we've worked to achieve." Marcus looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and realized that their temporary sanctuary might become a long-term arrangement. The safe house was comfortable, but it was still a prison of sorts, a place where his daughter would be protected, but also isolated from the normal life she deserved. What about school? What about Emma's friends, her normal routine? "We can arrange tutoring, supervised contact with selected friends, field trips to places where security can be maintained," Agent Walsh said. "It's not ideal, but it's temporary, and it's better than the alternatives." As evening approached and Agent Walsh departed with promises to check on them daily, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah and Emma in a federally protected apartment that felt both safer and more confined than anywhere they'd been since leaving Pine Ridge. Emma had awakened from her nap, refreshed and excited to have Sarah back in their lives, chattering about her unfinished wildlife project and the drawings she'd made of Colorado animals. "I brought your books," Emma announced, pulling a small backpack from their luggage and presenting Sarah with the field guides they'd been using for research. "I kept working on the project even when you were gone, because I knew you'd come back and help me finish it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the books, and Marcus realized that Emma's faith in her return had meant more to their former houseguest than any official recognition of her federal service could have provided. "Of course I came back," Sarah said softly. "I promised to help you with your project, and I always keep my promises to people I care about." Later, after Emma had been settled into the safe house's second bedroom, with Ranger standing guard beside her bed, Marcus and Sarah found themselves alone in the living room for the first time since her arrest. The space between them felt charged with unspoken emotions and unresolved questions that had been building since the moment she'd first appeared in their lives. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "I'm sorry for lying to you about my work, for putting you and Emma in danger, for disrupting your lives in ways that can't be undone." Marcus studied her face in the lamplight, noting the exhaustion around her eyes, the way she held herself, as if still recovering from injuries, both physical and emotional. Whatever else Sarah Mitchell might be, she was someone who had paid a high price for her commitment to doing what she believed was right. "You saved our lives," Marcus said simply. "If you hadn't warned us that night, if you hadn't prepared us for what was coming, Emma and I would probably be dead right now. But you're here, in federal protection, because of choices I made. Your daughter is sleeping in a government safe house instead of her own bed, because I brought federal crimes into your home." Marcus reached across the space between them and took Sarah's hand, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. "Emma is alive because you cared enough to risk your own safety to warn us. That matters more than where she's sleeping tonight." Sarah's smile was tremulous but genuine, and Marcus felt something shift between them, a recognition that the connection they'd developed during her stay in Pine Ridge had survived the test of federal investigations and criminal conspiracies. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "After the arrests are made, after the danger is over, do you go back to Pine Ridge and pretend none of this ever happened?" It was a question that Marcus had been avoiding, partly because the answer involved acknowledging feelings that he wasn't sure he was ready to examine. Sarah's presence in his life had awakened possibilities that he'd thought died with Rebecca, hopes for connection and partnership that extended beyond the simple mechanics of survival. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "A week ago, I thought I had my life figured out. Work, Emma, the daily routine of single parenthood in a small town. Then you appeared, and suddenly nothing was as simple as it used to be. Good things rarely are simple, Sarah said, her gray eyes holding his with an intensity that suggested she was asking a question that went far beyond their current circumstances. The question is whether the complexity is worth the possibility of something better than what you had before. Marcus thought about Emma's laughter during the week Sarah had stayed with them. The way their house had felt complete for the first time since Rebecca's death. The strange sense that he'd been waiting for someone like Sarah without realizing it. I think, Marcus said carefully, that some kinds of complexity are worth embracing, especially when they come with the possibility of love. The word hung between them like a confession and a promise, acknowledging what both of them had been feeling, but neither had been willing to name. Love was dangerous, risky, fraught with possibilities for loss and heartbreak, but it was also the only force strong enough to make the risks worthwhile. I love Emma, Sarah said quietly. I love the way she sees the world, the questions she asks, the trust she shows in people who prove they deserve it. And I love you, Marcus, for the father you are and the man you've shown yourself to be when everything was falling apart around us. Marcus felt his heart stop and restart as Sarah's words washed over him, carrying implications that would reshape their future in ways that went far beyond federal protection and criminal investigations. I love you too, he said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff into empty space where the only safety net was the strength of their connection to each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more debriefings, the ongoing work of building cases against people who had used federal authority to cover their crimes. But tonight, in a government safe house 15 floors above the Denver skyline, Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell began to build something that corruption couldn't touch and criminals couldn't destroy. A family forged in crisis and strengthened by the recognition that love, however complicated, was always worth fighting for, and must end. The attack came at dawn on their 4th day in the safe house, just as Marcus was beginning to believe that federal protection might actually keep his family secure until the criminal organization could be dismantled through legal channels. He woke to the sound of Rangers' urgent barking, a warning that cut through the early morning quiet like an alarm bell announcing imminent danger. "Sarah, get Emma," Marcus whispered, rolling out of bed and moving toward the reinforced windows that overlooked downtown Denver. Through the bulletproof glass, he could see black SUVs positioning themselves around the federal building's entrances, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of a military assault team. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying a sleepy Emma, both of them wearing the kind of hastily assembled clothing that suggested they dressed in darkness while prioritizing speed over appearance. Ranger pressed close to Emma's side, his intelligent eyes reflecting the tension that filled the safe house like smoke from an invisible fire. "How did they find us?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone trained to function under extreme stress despite the fear that Marcus could see in her gray eyes. "Does it matter?" Marcus replied, checking the deadbolts on the apartment's reinforced door. "They're here, which means federal protection isn't as secure as Agent Walsh claimed." Through the walls, they could hear the muffled sounds of combat, gunfire, shouting voices, the crash of doors being breached by force. The federal building's security was under assault by people with resources and training that matched anything the government could deploy in response. Emma clung to Sarah with the desperate intensity of a child who had learned that adults couldn't always protect her from dangers that existed beyond her understanding. At 9 years old, she was becoming far too familiar with the sound of violence, the reality that some problems couldn't be solved with kindness or negotiation. "Daddy, are the bad men coming for us?" Emma asked, her voice small but steady in the way that children's voices become when they've been forced to confront adult fears. "We're not going to let them hurt you, sweetheart," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure how he could make good on that promise when they were trapped 15 floors above street level, with armed criminals controlling the building's exits. The apartment's secure phone rang once, a harsh sound that cut through the distant gunfire like a blade. Marcus answered it, hoping to hear Agent Walsh's voice with his instructions for evacuation or rescue. "Mr. Thompson, this is Miguel Santos. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The voice was calm, cultured, speaking English with a slight accent that suggested education and sophistication, rather than the crude thuggery that Marcus had expected from a drug dealer. Santos sounded like a businessman, discussing a contractual dispute rather than a criminal threatening a family's life. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, though he suspected that Santos was referring to Sarah's knowledge of the criminal organization's operations. "Dr. Mitchell has information that could damage my business interests, Mr. Thompson. Information that she obtained through illegal surveillance and federal entrapment. I'm prepared to offer you and your daughter safe passage in exchange for her cooperation." Marcus looked at Sarah, who was shaking her head with the vehemence of someone who understood exactly what Santos was proposing. Her knowledge of the drug operation was the only leverage they possessed, but it was also the only thing keeping them alive as long as Santos needed her testimony suppressed, rather than simply eliminated. "What kind of cooperation?" Marcus asked, buying time, while he tried to think of escape routes from an apartment that had been designed to keep intruders out, rather than to allow occupants to flee. "Dr. Mitchell will accompany my associates to a location where we can discuss the terms of her continued silence. In exchange, you and your daughter will be released unharmed, with enough money to start new lives wherever you choose to go." It was a reasonable offer from Santos's perspective. Eliminate the threat that Sarah represented while avoiding the complications that would arise from murdering a federal witness and her innocent family. But Marcus understood that Sarah's cooperation would end with her death once Santos had extracted whatever information he needed about federal investigations. "No deal," Marcus said. "We stay together, or we don't deal at all." Santos's laugh was soft, but carried undertones that promised violence if his patience was exhausted by continued resistance. "Mr. Thompson, you're not in a position to negotiate. My people control this building, and federal reinforcements are at least 20 minutes away. You can give me Dr. Mitchell voluntarily, or I can take her by force and leave your bodies as a message to future federal witnesses about the cost of cooperation with law enforcement." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone while the sounds of combat grew louder and closer. Through the apartment's reinforced door, he could hear boots in the hallway, voices calling out room numbers, as Santos's people worked their way toward the safe house. "They're going to break down the door," Sarah said, moving to the apartment's kitchen and returning with the largest knife she could find. "When they do, I want you to take Emma into the bedroom and barricade the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Marcus said, though he knew that his presence wouldn't significantly improve their chances against trained killers with military weapons. "You're not leaving me," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the calm determination of someone who had accepted the necessity of sacrifice. "You're protecting Emma. That's what fathers do. They protect their children, even when it means making impossible choices." The apartment door exploded inward with a crash that shook the walls and sent debris flying across the living room. 3 men in tactical gear poured through the opening, their automatic weapons sweeping the room with professional efficiency as they searched for targets and threats. Marcus grabbed Emma and dove behind the kitchen counter, pulling her down as bullets shattered dishes and punched holes in the walls around them. Ranger launched himself at the nearest intruder with the savage intensity of a wolf protecting his pack, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's gun arm with enough force to break bones. Sarah rolled behind the couch, using the furniture as cover, while she called out to Marcus in a voice that carried desperate urgency. "The fire escape! There's an emergency ladder outside the bedroom window." Marcus looked toward the bedroom, calculating the distance they would have to cover while under fire from automatic weapons. It was 20 feet of open space that might as well have been 20 miles when crossed under the sights of professional killers. "Emma, when I say run, you go straight to the bedroom and don't look back," Marcus whispered to his daughter, who nodded with the trust that children show their parents even in the face of unthinkable danger. "Run!" Marcus and Emma sprinted across the living room, while Sarah provided covering fire with a pistol she'd taken from one of the fallen intruders. Her shots were accurate despite the chaos, forcing Santos's men to seek cover while the family fled toward their only possible escape route. They reached the bedroom just as more gunmen appeared in the hallway, their weapons trained on the doorway that Marcus slammed shut and secured with the room's heavy dresser. The bedroom window opened onto a fire escape that descended 15 floors to street level, a terrifying prospect under normal circumstances, but their only hope for survival. "I can't," Emma said, looking down at the dizzying drop to the street below. "Daddy, I'm scared." I know, sweetheart, Marcus said, lifting his daughter into his arms while calculating whether the fire escape could support their combined weight. But sometimes being brave means doing scary things because they're the only way to keep the people we love safe. Behind them, the bedroom door splintered under automatic weapons fire, and Marcus knew they had seconds before Santos's men broke through their improvised barricade. He climbed onto the fire escape with Emma in his arms, feeling the metal structure sway under their weight as 15 floors of empty air yawned beneath them. The descent was a nightmare of rusted metal and vertigo, with Emma clinging to her father while he negotiated ladder rungs and platform grating that hadn't been maintained for years. Above them, gunfire continued to echo from the safe house, but Marcus couldn't tell whether Sarah was still alive or had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. They reached the 10th floor when the fire escape began to pull away from the building, decades of weather and neglect finally overwhelming the structure's ability to support human weight. Marcus felt the platform tilting beneath his feet and realized they had perhaps 30 seconds before the entire fire escape collapsed and sent them plummeting to the street below. "Hold on tight," Marcus told Emma, wrapping his arms around her as he prepared to jump the gap between the collapsing fire escape and the building's 9th floor balcony. It was an impossible leap under normal circumstances, but desperation provided strength that logic said shouldn't exist. Marcus launched himself across the void, feeling the fire escape's final collapse behind them as they crashed onto the balcony in a tangle of arms and legs that left both of them bruised but alive. Through the apartment's sliding glass door, he could see a family eating breakfast, their faces frozen in shock as they witnessed what appeared to be people falling from the sky. "Call 911, Marcus shouted through the glass. "Federal building under attack." The family inside scrambled for their phone, while Marcus and Emma picked themselves up from the balcony floor, both of them bleeding from cuts and scrapes, but mobile enough to continue their escape. Behind them, the federal building continued to echo with gunfire, suggesting that the battle for control was far from over. Marcus used a patio chair to break the balcony's glass door, leading Emma through the startled family's apartment toward the building's main exit. The residents, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, watched in amazement as Marcus and Emma passed through their home like refugees from a war zone. "Thank you," Marcus called back as they reached the apartment's front door. "Sorry about the window." The building's lobby was chaos, filled with residents who had been awakened by gunfire and were trying to determine whether they should evacuate or shelter in place. Marcus and Emma pushed through the crowd toward the street, where police sirens were finally beginning to converge on the federal building. Outside, downtown Denver had become a war zone. Federal agents were engaged in running gun battles with Santos's people, while innocent bystanders fled the area or took cover behind vehicles and buildings. The sound of helicopters overhead suggested that air support was arriving, but the outcome of the battle remained uncertain. Marcus pulled Emma into the doorway of a shop across the street from the federal building, using the concrete structure as cover while he searched for any sign of Sarah among the combatants visible through the building's windows. 15 floors up, he could see muzzle flashes from what might have been the safe house, but the distance made it impossible to determine who was firing or whether anyone was still alive up there. "Daddy, where's Sarah?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened, as she realized that their escape had separated them from the woman who had become so important to their family. "I don't know, sweetheart," Marcus admitted, watching federal agents storm the building's main entrance while Santos's men attempted to escape through emergency exits. "But Sarah is very smart and very brave. If anyone can survive up there, it's her." The battle lasted another 20 minutes, with the sound of gunfire gradually diminishing as federal forces gained control of the building, floor by floor. Marcus and Emma watched from their hiding place as wounded combatants were evacuated, as Santos's surviving men were arrested, as the machinery of federal law enforcement finally asserted its authority over the criminal organization that had infiltrated its ranks. Agent Walsh appeared in the building's lobby, her clothes torn and bloody, but her bearing suggesting that she had survived the assault with her authority intact. She spoke briefly with other federal agents before scanning the street, her eyes searching for the family she had been assigned to protect. Marcus stepped out of the doorway, waving to catch her attention while keeping Emma close beside him. Agent Walsh's face flooded with relief as she saw them, and she jogged across the street with the urgency of someone who had feared the worst. "Marcus, Emma, Thank God you're safe, she said, kneeling down to Emma's level and checking both of them for serious injuries. We lost contact with the safe house when the attack began. How did you get out? Fire escape, Marcus said simply, though the explanation failed to capture the terror of their descent through collapsing metal and empty air. Sarah stayed behind to provide cover. Is she... Agent Walsh's smile was tired but genuine as she stood up and looked toward the federal building. Dr. Mitchell is alive, though she's going to need medical attention for some new injuries. She held off Santos's men long enough for our tactical team to reach the 15th floor. Without her actions, this could have ended very differently. Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest as Agent Walsh's words sank in. Sarah was alive. Injured, but alive. The woman who had become so central to his and Emma's lives had survived the battle that would finally end their long nightmare. Is it over? Emma asked, looking up at Agent Walsh with the hope of a child who had been disappointed by adult promises before. Are the bad men gone? Miguel Santos is dead, Agent Walsh replied, shot while resisting arrest. His organization is finished, and the corrupt federal agents who were working with him are either dead or in custody. It's over, Emma. You and your father can go home now. But as Marcus looked at the federal building where Sarah was receiving medical treatment, he realized that home had taken on a new meaning over the past weeks. Home wasn't just a house in Pine Ridge or a workshop filled with broken engines. Home was wherever his family was complete, wherever the people he loved could be safe and happy together. When can we see Sarah? Marcus asked. Soon, Agent Walsh promised. She's asking for both of you. I think she has something important to tell you about the future. As they waited for permission to reunite with Sarah, Marcus held Emma close and watched the Denver skyline stretch toward mountains that no longer seemed like places to hide from danger. The crisis was over, the criminals were defeated, and the future stretched ahead of them like an open road leading toward possibilities that he was finally ready to embrace. Whatever Sarah wanted to tell them about the future, Marcus was prepared to listen. After everything they had survived together, after all the risks they had taken for each other, he was ready to believe that love really could conquer the forces that sought to destroy it. The worst was behind them. The best, he hoped, was yet to come. Waits died less. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in his workshop behind the house on Maple Creek Road. But everything had changed in ways that made the familiar space feel like a window into a different life. The same tools hung on their pegboard hooks. The same workbench bore the scars of 1,000 repair jobs, and the same mountain view stretched beyond the grimy windows. But the workshop was no longer a refuge from loneliness. It had become the heart of a family business that served customers throughout Pine Ridge County. Sarah's veterinary practice occupied the converted barn next to Marcus's workshop, her equipment sharing space with hay bales and farming implements in a combination that somehow managed to feel both professional and rustic. The sign outside read, Mountain View Veterinary Services and Thompson Automotive, advertising the unlikely partnership between a federal agent turned small-town veterinarian and a widowed mechanic who had learned that love was worth any risk. Daddy, Dr. Peterson wants to know if you can look at his truck while Sarah checks on his cattle. Emma called from the doorway, her voice carrying across the workshop, with the confident authority of a 10-year-old who had appointed herself as the family business's unofficial coordinator. Marcus looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding and smiled at his daughter, noting how much she'd grown in the months since their return to Pine Ridge. The fear and uncertainty that had marked her features during their time as fugitives had been replaced by the kind of confident happiness that came from living in a world where the adults could be trusted to keep their promises. Tell Dr. Peterson we'll be right over, Marcus replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag that bore the permanent stains of honest work, and ask Sarah if she needs help loading her equipment. Emma nodded and disappeared toward the barn, where Sarah was preparing for their joint house call to the Peterson ranch. The combination of veterinary services and mechanical repairs had proved popular among Pine Ridge's farming community, where livestock and machinery were equally essential to daily survival. Marcus had worried that Sarah would find small-town life restrictive after years of federal law enforcement work, but she had adapted to rural veterinary practice with the same dedication she'd brought to fighting drug cartels. Her decision to leave the DEA had been final and irrevocable, motivated by a desire to build something positive rather than simply tearing down criminal organizations. Life's too short to spend it chasing people who choose to do evil, Sarah had explained, when Agent Walsh had offered her a promotion and a transfer to Washington, D.C. I'd rather spend my time healing animals and building a family with people who choose to do good. The family they had built together wasn't conventional by any traditional standard, but it worked in ways that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Marcus and Sarah had married 3 months after returning to Pine Ridge, in a ceremony that took place in the Methodist church where Rebecca was buried, with Emma serving as maid of honor and Ranger providing ring security with the dignity that only German shepherds can manage. Pastor Williams had initially expressed concerns about the speed of their courtship, but those concerns had evaporated when he witnessed the way Sarah interacted with Emma and the obvious happiness that had returned to Marcus's life. Sometimes, the pastor had concluded, love arrived on its own schedule rather than conforming to social expectations about appropriate mourning periods. The integration of Sarah into Pine Ridge's social fabric had been smoother than Marcus had anticipated, partly because small communities appreciated competent veterinary care, and partly because Emma's enthusiastic endorsement carried weight with families who had watched her grow up. Children, the townspeople agreed, were excellent judges of character when it came to adults who claimed to care about them. Mrs. Henderson had been particularly pleased by the arrangement, claiming credit for having encouraged Marcus to find someone nice during the lonely years after Rebecca's death. The fact that he'd found someone in such dramatic circumstances only added to the romantic appeal of their story, though most residents remained unaware of the federal crimes and criminal conspiracies that had brought Sarah into their lives. "The truck's loaded," Sarah announced as she appeared in the workshop doorway, wearing the kind of practical clothing that had replaced her federal agent wardrobe. Jeans, boots, and a veterinary jacket suited her better than government-issued suits had ever managed, making her look like someone who belonged in Pine Ridge rather than someone passing through on official business. Marcus studied his wife's face, still amazed by the transformation from federal agent to small-town veterinarian. The tension that had marked her features during their first meeting had been replaced by the kind of contentment that came from work that healed rather than destroyed, from relationships based on trust rather than operational necessity. "Ready?" Sarah asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. 6 months of marriage had taught them to read each other's expressions with the kind of accuracy that came from shared danger and mutual dependence. The drive to the Peterson Ranch took them through countryside that had been their refuge during the darkest period of their relationship, when federal corruption and criminal violence had threatened to destroy everything they were trying to build together. Now, the same mountain roads that had carried them to safety offered glimpses of a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary in its simple satisfaction. Emma chattered from the back seat about her latest school project, a presentation on Colorado wildlife that had earned her first place in the county science fair. Her research had been thorough and professional, guided by Sarah's expertise and illustrated with drawings that captured both scientific accuracy and artistic imagination. "Mrs. Morrison says I should consider becoming a veterinarian when I grow up," Emma announced, with the kind of casual confidence that children display when discussing their futures. "She says I have a natural understanding of animals and their behavior." "What do you think about that?" Sarah asked, turning in the passenger seat to face her stepdaughter with the genuine interest that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I think it sounds better than being a mechanic," Emma replied, earning a mock protest from Marcus that dissolved into laughter. "No offense, Daddy, but animals are more interesting than engines." Old Marcus found himself thinking about Emma's future as they arrived at the Peterson Ranch, about the choices that would be available to her as she grew up in a world where federal agents who fought corruption could become veterinarians who healed animals, where single fathers could find love again, where families could be forged in crisis and strengthened by mutual commitment to each other's welfare. The Peterson Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of pasture and forest, home to cattle, horses, and the kind of agricultural equipment that required Marcus's mechanical expertise on a regular basis. Dr. Peterson was a third-generation rancher who had inherited both the land and the stubborn independence that characterized most of Pine Ridge's farming community. "Marcus, Sarah, thank you for coming out," Dr. Peterson said as they unloaded their equipment near the ranch's main barn. "The cattle look healthy, but I want Sarah to check them anyway." And the truck's been making that grinding noise again, the one you fixed last month. It was the kind of routine service call that had become the foundation of their joint practice, combining Sarah's veterinary skills with Marcus's mechanical expertise to serve customers who needed both types of professional assistance. The arrangement benefited everyone involved, providing comprehensive service to rural clients while allowing Marcus and Sarah to work together in ways that strengthened their personal relationship. Sarah examined Dr. Peterson's cattle with the thoroughness that had made her reputation among Pine Ridge's farmers, checking each animal for signs of disease or injury, while discussing herd management techniques that could prevent future problems. Her federal training had taught her to pay attention to details that other people missed, a skill that translated perfectly to veterinary medicine. Marcus diagnosed the truck's problem as a worn bearing in the transmission, a repair that would take an hour and cost less than $50 in parts. It was honest work that served his community while providing the kind of income that allowed his family to live comfortably without depending on federal pensions or government assistance. Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Peterson said, as Sarah completed her examination of his prize bull, "I want you to know how grateful we are to have you in Pine Ridge. Quality veterinary care used to mean a 2-hour drive to Colorado Springs, but now we have someone right here who understands our needs." Sarah's smile was genuine as she accepted the compliment, but Marcus could see the slight shadow that crossed her features whenever someone praised her new life without understanding the cost of leaving her old one behind. Federal service had been more than just a career. It had been a calling, a commitment to justice that she'd abandoned for the sake of love and family stability. Sometimes, Sarah had told him during one of their late-night conversations, "I wonder if I'm being selfish, choosing personal happiness over professional duty. People are still suffering because of drug operations that I could be helping to investigate." Marcus had learned to recognize these moments of doubt, the times when Sarah questioned whether their life together was worth the sacrifice of her federal career. His response was always the same, a reminder that healing was as important as fighting, that building something positive mattered as much as tearing down criminal organizations. "You're doing important work here," Marcus would tell her. "Maybe not as dramatic as federal investigations, but important to the people who depend on you. Emma needs you, I need you, and this community needs you. That's not selfish. That's choosing to serve in a different way." The drive home from the Peterson ranch passed in comfortable silence, with Emma dozing in the back seat and Ranger maintaining his vigilant watch from the truck bed. The German Shepherd had adapted to their new life with the same resilience he'd shown during their flight from federal criminals, becoming the unofficial mascot of Mountain View Veterinary Services while maintaining his role as family protector. That evening, as they sat down to dinner in the kitchen where Sarah had first revealed her federal identity, Marcus found himself reflecting on the changes that 6 months had brought to their lives. The stack of overdue bills that had once dominated the kitchen table had been replaced by veterinary journals and Emma's homework assignments. The atmosphere of financial stress had given way to the comfortable routine of a dual-income household, where both parents contributed to their family's security. "Daddy," Emma said as they finished their meal, "can I ask you something about Mama?" Marcus felt his chest tighten at the mention of Rebecca, not from pain, but from the complexity of honoring his first wife's memory, while building a new life with his second. Emma had been asking more questions about her mother lately, trying to understand how Sarah fit into a family history that had been shaped by love and loss in equal measure. "Of course, sweetheart. What do you want to know? Do you think Mama would like Sarah? Do you think she would be happy that we're a family again?" It was the kind of question that children ask when they're trying to reconcile competing loyalties, when they need permission to love new people without betraying the memory of those who came before. Marcus looked at Sarah, who was watching the conversation with the careful attention of someone who understood the delicate nature of blended families. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that your mama loved us enough to want us to be happy, even if that happiness came from people she never got to meet. She would like Sarah because Sarah takes care of us, because she makes us laugh, because she helps you with your homework and teaches you about animals." Emma nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, then turned to Sarah with the directness that characterized most of her important conversations. "Sarah, do you mind that I still talk about Mama sometimes? Do you mind that there are pictures of her in our house?" Sarah reached across the table and took Emma's hand, her gray eyes bright with tears that spoke of understanding rather than sadness. "Emma, Your mama will always be part of this family, even though she's not here with us anymore. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm just trying to add to the love that already exists in this house. There's room for both of us in your heart, just like there's room for both of us in your daddy's heart. It was exactly the right thing to say, the kind of wisdom that came from genuine love rather than professional training. Emma smiled with the radiant happiness of a child whose world had been made whole again, whose family had been restored in ways that honored the past while embracing the future. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed with her stuffed rabbit and Ranger had assumed his protective position beside her door, Marcus and Sarah sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge over the Pine Ridge Mountains. The crisp October air carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter, familiar smells that spoke of home and belonging, and the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing exactly where you were supposed to be. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, taking Sarah's hand as they rocked gently in the porch swing that he'd built during their engagement. "About leaving federal service? About marrying a small-town mechanic? About becoming stepmother to a 10-year-old girl who thinks she wants to be a veterinarian?" Sarah's smile was visible in the starlight, carrying warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the choice she'd made to build rather than tear down. "About all of it," Marcus said. "The whole complicated, messy, wonderful package." Sarah was quiet for a moment, listening to the night sounds of their mountain community, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the soft breathing of a sleeping child in the house behind them. "No regrets," she said finally. "This is where I belong, Marcus. With you, with Emma, with this community that's given me a chance to heal instead of fight. I spent years chasing criminals through federal bureaucracy, and I was good at it. But this feels like coming home in ways that government service never did." Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling the wedding ring that she wore alongside the small scar on her finger where a federal identification chip had been removed. Some connections to her past had been severed permanently, but others had been transformed into something better, stronger, more meaningful than official duty could ever provide. "I love you," Marcus said, words that still carried the wonder of someone who had never expected to say them again after Rebecca's death. "I love you too," Sarah replied. "I love this life we've built together, this family we've created from 3 broken pieces that somehow fit together perfectly." Inside the house, Ranger's soft whine drifted through the screen door, followed by Emma's sleepy voice asking if everything was all right. It was the sound of family, of home, of love that had survived federal investigations and criminal conspiracies to become something unshakable and permanent. "Everything's perfect, sweetheart," Sarah called back. "Go back to sleep." And as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountain wind carried the scent of coming winter through their peaceful valley, Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell Thompson sat together on their front porch and watched their world settle into the kind of quiet happiness that made all the risks, all the fear, all the uncertainty worth enduring. They had found each other in crisis, forged their love in danger, and built their family from the recognition that some things, love, loyalty, the determination to protect innocent children, were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The past was behind them. The future stretched ahead like an open road leading toward possibilities they were finally ready to embrace. And in the present moment, on a front porch in Pine Ridge, Colorado, 3 people and 1 very intelligent dog had everything they needed to call their lives complete. The story that had begun with a car accident in a mountain blizzard had become a love story, a family story, a story about the way ordinary people could create extraordinary happiness when they chose to trust each other with their hearts, their hopes, and their futures. It was, Marcus reflected as he held his wife's hand and listened to his daughter's peaceful breathing, the best possible ending to a story that had once seemed destined for tragedy. Love had indeed conquered all, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the daily choice to care for each other, to build together, to create something beautiful from the raw materials of trust and commitment and hope. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones, measured not in headlines or federal convictions, but in the sound of a child's laughter, the warmth of a lover's hand, and the peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged.